Imagine for a moment that you open your eyes in the morning and the world around you is perfectly still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that makes you wonder if reality itself has paused, waiting for something. The clock on your wall isn't ticking. The sunlight streaming through your window doesn't shift or change. Even the dust particles hanging in that beam of light seem suspended, frozen mid-dance. This is the world you would wake to if time only moved when you were asleep. Every moment of your waking life would feel frozen. No clocks ticking, no aging faces, no changing shadows. Just a permanent stillness wrapped around your awareness. Think about what that means. Right now, as you listen to these words, you can feel time passing. You can sense it in the subtle way your body shifts, the way your thoughts move from one idea to the next, the way the world around you breathes and changes. But in this imagined reality, none of that would happen. The world wouldn't breathe. It would simply be a photograph, a moment captured and held indefinitely until you decided to close your eyes again. You would never experience the passage of time directly. Days, months, and even years would disappear entirely while you slept, creating the illusion that you were living in a single, endless moment. You might go to bed on a Tuesday evening, and when you wake, it could be Thursday or next month or 5 years later. But you wouldn't know. There would be no sensation of that time passing, no dreams to mark the hours, no sense of having traveled through the night. Just the closing of eyes and then the opening, like turning off a light and turning it back on, except the room has aged in that instant of darkness. The concept of the present moment would feel fragile, because it could vanish completely every time you closed your eyes. Philosophers and poets have long spoken about living in the now, about being present, about cherishing each moment as if it were your last. But in this world, that advice would carry a weight almost too heavy to bear, because the present moment wouldn't just slip away gradually, the way it does for us now. It would be erased. Completely. The second your eyelids closed, the now would cease to exist, replaced by some other now that you had no part in creating, no hand in shaping. You would be a visitor in time, never a participant. Silence would become deeply symbolic, representing the paused universe that exists only while consciousness remains alert. In our world, silence is simply the absence of sound. But there, in that frozen reality, silence would mean so much more. It would be the sound of time itself, holding its breath, waiting. People might seek out silence, not for peace, but for confirmation. Proof that the world was still paused, still waiting for them to fall asleep before it dared to move again. Churches, temples, meditation halls, they might all become places not of worship, but of listening. Listening to the silence that proves you are awake, that you still exist in the only moment that feels real. Timekeeping devices would exist only as ceremonial objects, reminding people of a force they could never observe directly. Clocks would still be made, still hung on walls and worn on wrists, but they wouldn't serve the purpose they do now. You couldn't watch the second hand sweep around the face, couldn't count the minutes until an appointment or the hours until sunset. Instead, clocks would become artifacts of faith. You would look at them when you woke and see that time had passed. The hands would have moved, the numbers would have changed, but you wouldn't have witnessed it. These devices would be evidence of a phenomenon you could never truly experience, like photographs of a country you've never visited. They would tell you that time exists, that it moves and flows, but always just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of your waking mind. Daily routines would feel sacred, because they would be the only moments where life felt consistent and unchanged. Breakfast, work, conversation, evening walks, these simple, ordinary activities would take on an almost ritualistic quality. Because while you were awake, while you were present, nothing could change. The world would be exactly as you left it the last time you opened your eyes, minus however much time had passed while you slept. Your morning coffee would taste the same every day. The route you walk would never alter. The people you see would be frozen in their expressions, their positions, their lives, until you closed your eyes and let time move them forward. In a strange way, your waking life would become the only constant, the only thing you could rely on, even though it was actually the only time when nothing could change at all. Waking up would feel like teleportation. You would close your eyes in one world and open them in another, with no memory of the journey in between. Imagine lying down in your bed on a spring evening, the air warm and filled with the scent of flowers. You close your eyes, and when you open them again, it's winter. Snow covers the ground outside your window. Months have passed. Your body has lived through all of that time. Your cells have divided, your hair has grown, your heart has beaten millions more times. But you weren't there for any of it. You experienced none of it. It's as if you stepped through a door in May and emerged in December, with no hallway connecting the two rooms. Every sleep would be a jump, a leap forward through time, and you would wake each morning not knowing how far you'd traveled or what world you'd find waiting for you. Aging would feel instant. You might go to sleep feeling young and wake up noticeably older, never sensing the slow decline, only the sudden result. In our reality, we age gradually. We see the lines form slowly around our eyes, feel our joints stiffen bit by bit over years, watch our hair turn gray one strand at a time. It's a process we can track, anticipate, come to terms with. But in this other world, aging would be a series of shocks. You would look in the mirror one morning and see a stranger's face looking back. Older, more worn, marked by time you never felt passing. Parents would see their children grow in jumps and starts. Babies becoming toddlers overnight, teenagers transforming into adults between one sleep and the next. The gentle slope of aging would become a staircase, each step a sudden drop into the next phase of life, and you would stumble down it with no warning, no preparation, no chance to savor the moments in between. Eventually, society might value wakefulness more than achievement, believing that being conscious is the only true way to exist. What would success mean in such a world? Would people still strive to build careers, create art, make discoveries? Or would the highest goal simply be to remain awake as long as possible, to exist in the only reality that feels real? There might be movements, philosophies, even religions built around the idea that consciousness itself is the ultimate purpose. Sleep would be seen as a necessary evil, something to be minimized, resisted. People might push themselves to stay awake for days, even weeks, desperately clinging to the present moment because it's the only one they can truly experience. To be awake would be to be alive. To sleep would be to surrender that life, temporarily, to forces beyond your control. Over time, people might begin to see sleep not as rest, but as a quiet sacrifice, where consciousness steps aside so existence itself can continue. Because that's what it would be, wouldn't it? A sacrifice. Every time you closed your eyes, you would be giving up your claim on reality, allowing time to move forward without you, allowing the world to change and shift in age while you remained absent, unconscious, unaware. Sleep would become an act of faith, a trust that when you opened your eyes again, there would still be a world worth waking to. And yet it would also be necessary, because without sleep, time wouldn't move at all. The universe would remain frozen, trapped in an eternal now, going nowhere. So you would sleep not for yourself, but for the continuation of everything else. You would close your eyes knowing that you were releasing time from your grip, setting it free to run ahead without you, hoping, always hoping, that it wouldn't run too far before you caught up again. This is the world where time only moves when you're asleep. A world of frozen moments and sudden jumps, of silence and sacrifice, of consciousness held precious because it's the only time that feels like living. A strange world. A lonely world, perhaps. But in its own way, a world that makes you wonder about the one we actually live in, and whether we truly appreciate the gift of experiencing time as it passes, moment by moment, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. In this world we've been imagining, where time only moves when you're asleep, something profound would shift in the way we understand power itself. Sleep would become the most powerful force in the universe, because every second of history, wars, discoveries, star births, and civilizations would only unfold while consciousness was turned off. Think about what that means. Everything that has ever happened, everything that ever will happen, would occur only in your absence. The rise and fall of empires, the birth of stars in distant galaxies, the first words spoken by a child, the final breath of the elderly. All of it would take place while you were unconscious, while you had relinquished your hold on the present moment. In our current reality, we think of power in terms of control, influence, the ability to shape events. But their power would belong entirely to sleep. It would be the gatekeeper of all change, all progress, all movement. Awake, you would be utterly powerless to change anything, to move anything forward. The universe would be your frozen museum, beautiful perhaps, but utterly still. Only by surrendering to sleep, by letting go of consciousness entirely, would you permit reality to continue its journey. Sleep would be the engine of existence itself, and every person who ever lived would be forced to bow to it, night after night, surrendering their awareness so that the cosmos could take another breath. Fear of sleep would grow, because every time you fell asleep, you would be surrendering control over the entire universe for however long your unconsciousness lasted. Can you imagine that fear? The deep, primal anxiety that would accompany the simple act of closing your eyes at night? Because you wouldn't just be resting. You would be handing over the keys to reality itself. Anything could happen while you slept. Anything. Loved ones could age. Relationships could dissolve. Natural disasters could reshape the landscape. Political revolutions could topple governments. And you would have no say in any of it. No way to stop it, no way to influence it, no way even to witness it. Some people might lie awake at night, fighting sleep with every tool at their disposal, terrified of what the world might become in their absence. What if you went to sleep and woke to find that everyone you loved had died of old age? What if you closed your eyes for what felt like an instant and opened them to find yourself alone in a world you no longer recognized? The fear wouldn't be irrational. It would be completely justified, because sleep would be the moment when you lost all agency, all control, all ability to protect yourself or the things you cared about. Insomnia would feel like a form of time control. Staying awake would mean freezing reality itself, trapping the universe in a paused state as long as your eyes remained open. And so some people might embrace insomnia, not as a curse, but as a kind of power. As long as you stayed awake, nothing could change. Nothing could hurt you. The people you loved would remain exactly as they were. The world would stay familiar, stable, safe. You would be holding time hostage with your consciousness, refusing to blink, refusing to surrender, keeping everything and everyone suspended in the amber of the present moment. There would be a terrible appeal to that, wouldn't there? The illusion of control in a reality where control is otherwise impossible. Stay awake long enough and you could keep the world exactly as you wanted it. Of course, it would be an illusion, because eventually you would have to sleep. Biology would demand it. And when you finally collapsed into unconsciousness, time would rush forward like water through a broken dam, making up for all those hours or days you'd held it back. The changes you'd been avoiding would hit you all at once, compressed and concentrated and overwhelming. Some people might choose to stay awake for extreme lengths of time, effectively choosing to live outside of history itself. Imagine the ones who pushed it to the edge, who took stimulants, who trained their bodies and minds to resist sleep for weeks, months, even longer. They would become like hermits, not of space but of time. While the rest of humanity moved forward through the centuries, experiencing change and growth and loss, These wakeful ones would remain stranded in their chosen moment, refusing to let it pass. They would watch the world stay frozen while they knew, intellectually, that time was waiting just on the other side of their eyelids, patient and inevitable. What would drive someone to make that choice? Perhaps love. A desperate desire to keep a dying parent alive by never sleeping, by never allowing time to take them away. Perhaps fear, a terror of the unknown future that made the frozen present seem preferable. Perhaps obsession, a belief that they could outlast time itself if they only stayed conscious long enough. These people would be tragic figures, fighting a battle they could never win, because eventually the body fails, the mind breaks, and sleep comes whether invited or not. And when it did, they would wake to find that the world had left them far, far behind. Rituals around sleep would become sacred, as societies develop ceremonies to honor the moments when time is allowed to move. Because if sleep was this powerful, this consequential, it couldn't be treated casually. You wouldn't just yawn, brush your teeth, and crawl into bed. No, going to sleep would become an event, a ceremony, something deserving of gravity and intention. Families might gather together before bed, holding hands, speaking prayers or affirmations, acknowledging what they were about to do. Release their grip on reality and allow time to flow forward without them. There might be sleep temples, places where trained facilitators would guide people through the transition from waking to sleeping, helping them make peace with the surrender of control. Imagine the chants, the incense, the quiet music designed to ease the fear and sanctify the act. Going to sleep would be treated like a small death because in a way it would be. You would be choosing to end the version of yourself that exists in this moment, trusting that when you wake, a new version will take its place in a world that has moved on without you. These rituals would help people cope with that existential weight, transforming terror into reverence, panic into ceremony. Dreams would become unsettlingly symbolic, because while your mind wandered through imaginary worlds, the real universe would be actively moving forward without you. Think about how strange that would feel once you truly understood it. You're dreaming of flying through impossible landscapes, having conversations with people who don't exist, experiencing emotions about situations that never happened. And while you're lost in that theater of the mind, real things are occurring. Real stars are being born. Real people are living their lives, aging, changing, dying. Real history is being written. Your dreams would feel like a distraction, almost like a betrayal. Your consciousness, instead of simply resting, would be entertaining you with fantasies while the actual universe moved forward in your absence. Some people might come to resent their dreams, seeing them as frivolous distractions from the serious business of time passing. Others might cling to them desperately, preferring the imaginary worlds they could control to the real world they could not. Dreams would take on new meaning, new weight. They would become the stories you told yourself while the real story, the only story that mattered, unfolded outside your awareness. Nightmares would be terrifying, not for their content, but because they would accompany real, irreversible change. Imagine waking from a nightmare, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, still shaking from whatever horror your mind had conjured. But the real horror would be this. While you were experiencing that nightmare, time was moving. While you were being chased by monsters that didn't exist, real things were happening that you could never undo. Maybe someone you loved crossed a threshold they couldn't step back from. Maybe an opportunity was lost forever. Maybe the world shifted in ways that couldn't be reversed. The nightmare in your head would be nothing compared to the reality you woke to, and you would have no way of knowing which was worse until you opened your eyes. People might begin to mistrust the morning, treating wakefulness as an unreliable narrator of what truly occurred. Because how could you ever really know what happened while you slept? You would wake to a changed world, yes. The clock would have moved forward. Things would be different. But the specifics, the details, the actual events that transpired, those would be lost to you forever. You would have to piece together what happened from evidence, from clues like a detective arriving at a crime scene long after the crime was committed. Did your relationships change because of something that happened while you slept, or were they always going to change? Did that plant in your window die because of neglect during waking hours, or because of something that occurred while time was moving and you were absent? Every morning would be an investigation, an attempt to understand a history you didn't live through. And over time, that might breed a deep mistrust of waking life itself. Because if you can't witness time passing, can you ever really trust what the world tells you about where it's been? Anxiety would feel abstract, because fear of the future would be fear of sleep rather than fear of time passing. In our world, anxiety often comes from anticipating what's coming. The test tomorrow, the difficult conversation next week, the uncertainty of next year. But there, the future wouldn't arrive while you were awake. It would only come while you slept. So anxiety wouldn't be about next Tuesday or next month. It will be about tonight, about closing your eyes, about the act of sleeping itself, because that's when the future you fear would actually arrive. You couldn't worry about what tomorrow would bring in the normal sense, because tomorrow wouldn't bring anything while you were awake to experience it. Tomorrow would only come if you slept, and so the fear would focus entirely on that surrender, that letting go, that terrifying moment when you release the present and allow the future to rush in. Eventually, consciousness itself might be seen as a flaw, an interruption in the universe's natural flow. What if, over generations, after centuries of living this way, humanity began to see things differently? What if consciousness started to feel less like a gift and more like a burden? After all, the universe only moves forward when we're not paying attention. Time only flows when we surrender awareness. In a strange, paradoxical way, being conscious would mean stopping the universe. Being aware would mean freezing existence itself. And some philosophers, some thinkers might begin to argue that consciousness is actually the problem, that we are interrupting something natural and beautiful with our stubborn insistence on being awake, on being present, on existing in the moment. They might suggest that the ideal state would be perpetual sleep, perpetual unconsciousness, allowing time to flow freely without interruption. Of course, others would argue fiercely against this, insisting that consciousness is the only thing that gives existence meaning, that a universe no one is awake to experience might as well not exist at all. But the debate would rage, and some people might truly come to believe that the most generous thing they could do, the most selfless act imaginable, would be to close their eyes and never open them again, to let time move forward forever uninterrupted, flowing freely into eternity while they dreamed on, somewhere in the darkness, no longer freezing the universe with the burden of their awareness. This is the power and the fear of sleep in a world where time only moves when you're unconscious. A world where rest becomes responsibility, where dreams accompany irreversible change, where every morning is a mystery and every night is a sacrifice. A world where the simple act of closing your eyes carries the weight of the entire universe, and where consciousness itself might be the greatest prison of all. In a world where time only moves when you're asleep, the relationship between consciousness and the physical body would become deeply strange, almost alien. Medicine would change completely because healing, cell regeneration, and disease progression would only occur while patients were asleep. Think about what this means for anyone who's ever been sick or injured. Right now, when you cut your finger, you can watch it heal over days. You see the scab form, watch it shrink, notice the new skin growing underneath. It's a process you can observe, track, and understand. But there, healing wouldn't be a process at all. It would be an event. You would go to sleep with a wound and wake with a scar. Or perhaps wake still wounded, if you hadn't slept long enough for time to complete its work. Doctors would become something like fortune tellers, unable to observe their patients improving, only able to check on them after each sleep and see what time had decided to do. A surgeon couldn't watch a patient stabilize on the operating table, couldn't monitor vital signs changing moment by moment. They would have to put the patient under anesthesia, forcing them to sleep, and hope that when they woke, time had moved the body in the right direction. Hope that the sutures held. Hope that infection didn't take root. Hope that the treatment they administered during the frozen waking hours would work once time finally moved again. Disease would become a gamble with sleep. Cancer would advance only in those dark hours, tumors growing in sudden spurts rather than gradual progressions. A patient might go to sleep with an early-stage diagnosis and wake to find it had metastasized, or conversely, wake to find that treatment had worked, that the body had fought back successfully while consciousness was absent. There would be no way to monitor, no way to adjust course mid-treatment. Just the treatment plan, the surrender to sleep, and the discovery of what happened when morning came. Emergency situations would feel surreal since injuries could not worsen or improve until sleep allowed time to move again. Imagine being a paramedic in this world, arriving at an accident scene. Someone is bleeding badly, but the blood isn't flowing. It's frozen midstream, suspended in that awful moment of injury. The person is conscious, aware, in pain perhaps, but their condition cannot deteriorate. They cannot bleed out. The injury is locked in place, waiting. The only way to save them or lose them would be to make them sleep, to render them unconscious, allowing time to move so that their body could either heal or fail. There would be an agonizing choice in every emergency. Keep the person awake and keep them stable, frozen in their current state indefinitely, or put them to sleep and gamble that time will be kind, that their body will heal rather than decline. Victims of accidents might beg to stay awake, terrified of what might happen if they closed their eyes. Others might beg for sleep, hoping for healing, willing to take the risk. And the emergency workers would have to decide, knowing that consciousness keeps people trapped in their current condition, but sleep could bring either salvation or death, with no way to predict which. Parents would experience childhood in sudden jumps, watching their children grow in noticeable steps rather than gradual changes. This might be one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this reality. In our world, parents often say their children grew up too fast, that they blinked and suddenly their baby was a teenager. But at least they got to see the in-between moments, the first wobbly steps, the gradual expansion of vocabulary, the slow stretching of limbs and strengthening of features. Their parents would see none of that. They would put their infant to bed and wake to find a toddler, tuck in their child one night and wake to find a preteen standing where a little one used to be. Every morning would bring a small shock, a moment of disorientation. Is this the same child I said goodnight to? They would be, of course, in the continuity of identity in memory and personality. But physically, they would have leaped forward, skipping over all those precious, subtle changes that make childhood feel like a journey. Parents would take thousands of photos, not to remember moments, but to fill in the gaps, to create a false timeline of gradual change where only sudden jumps existed. They would study their children's faces each morning like archaeologists examining artifacts, trying to understand what time had done while they weren't watching. And the children themselves would experience their parents the same way. Aging in jumps, growing older overnight, the vigor and youth draining away in noticeable increments rather than the graceful, almost invisible slope we know. Every generation would watch the previous one deteriorate and fast forward. A series of sudden reminders that time, even though you can't feel it passing, is still consuming everyone you love. Animals with shorter sleep cycles would experience reality in more frequent time leaps, making their lives feel faster and more fragmented than human lives. Consider a house cat, sleeping 16 hours a day in multiple sessions. In our world, that's just normal cat behavior. But there, each time the cat dozed off, time would leap forward. The cat would experience reality in much smaller, more frequent chunks than humans do. A single human day might feel, to a cat, like dozens of disconnected moments, each separated by a jump through time. Their reality would be more fragmented, more disjointed, like a film with most of the frames removed, flickering and jumping from scene to scene with barely any continuity. And what about animals that barely sleep at all? Certain species of sharks, for instance, that must keep moving to breathe. Would they experience an almost entirely frozen world? A reality where time barely moves because they barely sleep? Their lives would stretch out in one long, eternal present, unchanging and still. Meanwhile, animals like bats and sloths, sleeping up to 20 hours a day, would experience time rushing past, their waking moments rare and brief interruptions in a reality that was mostly movement, mostly change, mostly time flowing freely without them. The animal kingdom would splinter into different experiences of time itself, each species living in its own temporal reality based solely on its sleep patterns. Humans would be somewhere in the middle, not as fragmented as cats, not as frozen as sharks, but disconnected from both the creatures that experienced more time and those that experienced less. Seasonal changes would appear abruptly, with entire shifts in weather happening overnight rather than slowly across weeks. You would go to sleep during a warm autumn evening, leaves still green on the trees, a gentle breeze carrying the last warmth of summer, and you would wake to winter, snow on the ground, ice on the windows. The trees are bare and skeletal against a gray sky. There would be no gradual cooling, no watching the leaves change color day by day, no slow preparation for the cold. Just summer, then autumn, then winter, each one arriving fully formed while you were unconscious. Farmers would have to guess at planting times, unable to watch the slow warming of spring soil, unable to observe the gradual lengthening of days. They would plant during one waking period and hope that by the next time they woke, conditions would be right for growth. Weather forecasting would become less about predicting change and more about predicting what you would wake up to. A spiritual practice almost, reading signs and patterns, trying to guess what time would bring while you slept. And storms would be particularly eerie. You couldn't watch a storm approach, couldn't see the clouds gathering, the wind picking up. You would simply wake to the aftermath. Fallen trees, flooded streets, a landscape rearranged by forces you never witnessed. Or you might fall asleep under clear skies and wake to find yourself in the middle of a hurricane that arrived while you were unconscious. The world transformed into chaos in the space between one breath and the next. Reproduction would feel mysterious, as pregnancies could advance dramatically between nights of sleep. A woman would discover she was pregnant, perhaps a few weeks along, barely showing. And then, each time she slept, she would wake to find her body further transformed. One night's sleep might bring her to the second trimester. Another might bring her to the third. The gradual swelling, the slow shifts in her body that usually give months of preparation, would instead happen in rapid jumps. She might go to sleep one night in her 8th month and wake in labor, time having compressed the final weeks into a single period of unconsciousness. There would be no time to slowly adjust to the reality of impending parenthood. No months of gradually preparing the nursery, watching the belly grow, feeling the baby's movements increase over time. Just sudden advances, each morning bringing a new stage with little warning. And for the partner, the experience would be even more surreal. Watching the person they love transform overnight, again and again, carrying a child they could never see developing, only appearing more and more present in sudden increments. And what about the child itself, growing in the womb? Would they experience time? Or would they be frozen too, developing only when the mother slept, their entire gestation happening in the darkness of her unconsciousness, a life forming in the gaps between her awareness? Birthdays would lose emotional meaning because age would be revealed rather than celebrated. We celebrate birthdays as milestones, marking the completion of another year of life. But their age wouldn't be something you lived through, it would be something that happened to you while you weren't looking. You wouldn't feel yourself getting older throughout the year. You would simply wake up one day and discover, by checking a calendar, that time had moved you forward another year, another decade, another era of life. What is there to celebrate in that? Not the living of the year because you didn't experience it, only the discovery that it passed. Birthdays might become somber occasions, moments of accounting, where you wake up and take stock of how much time took from you while you were asleep. Another year gone, more youth spent, more life consumed, and you weren't there for any of it. Children wouldn't look forward to being older, because age wouldn't bring accumulated experiences and wisdom, just sudden, unearned advancement. And the elderly wouldn't have the comfort of a long life lived, because they wouldn't remember living it. Only the waking moments would feel real, and everything else would be gaps, jumps, missing time that their bodies experienced but their minds did not. Longevity would feel meaningless, since a long life could pass in what feels like only a handful of waking moments. Someone could live to be 100 years old by the calendar, but if they slept 8 hours a day, and time only moved during those hours, then they would have only been conscious for 33 years worth of moments. And those moments would be frozen, unchanging. So in terms of actual experience time, in terms of feeling life flow from moment to moment, they would have experienced almost nothing. A handful of days, perhaps. A collection of waking periods, each one identical and still, with massive jumps of time between them. What would be the point of longevity, then? You could live for centuries by the calendar, but experience only a few subjective years of consciousness, and even those years would be trapped in frozen moments where nothing could happen, nothing could change. Long life would be an illusion, a trick of the calendar that had no correlation to actual lived experience. The body would no longer feel like a process, but a series of sudden outcomes. Think about how we experience our bodies now. We feel ourselves getting tired, feel our hunger growing, feel the ache in our muscles after exercise fading over hours and days. Our bodies are processes, constantly in motion, constantly changing. But there, your body would only change while you slept. While you were awake, it would be frozen in whatever state sleep left it in. You wouldn't feel yourself getting hungry, you would wake up hungry or not. Wouldn't feel exhaustion creeping in, you would wake up tired or refreshed with no sense of the transition. Your body would feel like a mystery, something that happened to you rather than something you inhabited. Each morning would be a reveal. What did time do to my body while I was gone? Am I stronger, weaker, healthier, sicker? There would be no feedback loop, no way to feel cause and effect in your own flesh. Just outcomes appearing suddenly, disconnected from any sense of process or progression. Nature itself would seem to operate only in darkness, because that's when everything would happen. Plants growing, flowers blooming, fruit ripening, decay spreading, ecosystems shifting and changing and evolving. All of it occurred while humanity slept. The natural world would be a thing of darkness and mystery, never witnessed in motion, only discovered in its new forms each morning. The sun would never actually move across the sky while you watched. Rain would never actually fall while you were conscious. Rivers would never flow, waves would never crash, wind would never blow, not while anyone was awake to see it. Nature would be like a stage that only came alive when the audience left, performing its grand dramas in the empty theater of human unconsciousness, leaving only the evidence of its performance for people to discover when they returned. And over time, that might change how humanity thought about the natural world entirely, not as something to observe and study and understand through direct experience, but as something fundamentally separate, fundamentally other, something that existed in the realm of sleep and time and darkness, forever beyond the reach of waking eyes. In a world where time only moves when you're asleep, one of the most profound challenges would be the nature of memory itself. Memories would feel unreliable because the world could change dramatically between sleeps, making it hard to tell whether something truly happened or whether it vanished in the night. Think about how memory works for us now. We remember events in sequence, connected by the thread of continuous time. We know what happened before and what happened after because we experienced the flow between them. But that flow wouldn't exist. Your memories would be islands, disconnected moments with vast, unknowable oceans of time between them. You might remember saying goodbye to someone you loved, and you might remember them being gone. But everything that happened between those two moments, the slow decline of the relationship, the difficult conversations, the gradual growing apart, all of that would have occurred while you slept, while time moved without you. So which memory is real? Did you really say goodbye? Or did the world simply change while you weren't looking, replacing the person you knew with their absence? How could you trust your own mind when the evidence it provides is full of gaps, missing the very connections that give events meaning? People might begin to doubt themselves constantly. Did I really have that conversation? Or did I dream it? Was that person really there yesterday? Or have weeks passed and I'm misremembering? The inability to experience time passing would erode confidence in personal memory, because memory relies on continuity, and continuity would be impossible to experience directly. Every recollection would come with a shadow of doubt, a whisper asking, "But what happened while you were asleep? What changed? What disappeared? What was rewritten by time moving forward without your knowledge?" Photography and recordings would become priceless, because they would be the only proof that the world had changed while no one was watching. Cameras would be everywhere, running constantly during waking hours, documenting everything. Not for nostalgia, not for art, but for evidence. Proof that things were a certain way before you slept. Proof that change occurred. You would photograph your loved ones before bed, and again upon waking, to see how much time had passed, to see what time had done to their faces. You would record the date, the weather, the state of the garden, the contents of your refrigerator, anything that might change, so that you could compare and understand what happened while you were unconscious. These images and recordings would be studied like archaeological artifacts, examined for clues about the passage of time. How much did the flowers grow? How much snow accumulated? How much did that child age? The photographs wouldn't be memories. They would be data points, objective measurements of time's passage that existed independent of human consciousness. They would be trusted more than the human mind, more than personal recollection, because they couldn't doubt themselves. They simply showed what was and what is, and the difference between the two was the only history anyone could truly know. Families would maintain vast archives of images, videos, recordings, treating them not as sentimental keepsakes but as essential documents. Losing these records would be catastrophic, like losing a part of your own existence, because without them, you would have no way to prove what came before, no way to connect the present moment to any version of the past. Written journals would feel more real than personal memory, because they would be the only witnesses to change that no one experienced. Imagine sitting down each morning to write in a journal, not about your feelings or your dreams, but about facts, documenting what you observe, what has changed since you last wrote. The journal becomes a conversation with yourself across time. The you who went to sleep and the you who woke up are different people in a sense, separated by hours or days or years of time they didn't experience. So you write to yourself, leaving notes, recording observations, creating a chain of evidence that you can follow forward. Reading back through these journals would be an eerie experience. You would see your own handwriting documenting events you don't remember living through, because they happened while you were asleep. You would read about people whose names you recognize, but whose relationships to you have changed in ways you never witnessed. The journal would tell you that someone was your friend, but your current waking reality shows them as a stranger, and you have no memory of what happened between those two states. The journal knows, in a way. It recorded the observations, the evidence of change. But you don't know. You weren't there. Over time, people might come to trust their journals more than their own memories. The written word, committed to paper while conscious, would feel more solid, more real than the fragile, gap-filled recollections of a mind that keeps losing time. Your journal would become your true memory, and your brain would be merely the tool you use to read it. Historical records would be written with uncertainty, because no one could confirm how long events truly lasted. Historians would face an impossible task. How do you write history when no one experienced time passing? How do you know how long a war lasted when all you have is a series of frozen snapshots? A declaration of war, a battle scene, a treaty signing, with no way to measure the time between them. You could count sleeps, perhaps, adding up how many times people went to bed and woke up during a conflict. But that wouldn't tell you how much actual time passed, because different people sleep different amounts, and time could move differently during each sleep. History books would be filled with qualifiers, with admissions of uncertainty. This war lasted approximately. This empire rose over an estimated. The exact duration of this period is unknown, but evidence suggests the past would be fuzzy, imprecise, reconstructed from clues rather than remembered from experience. And the further back you looked, the fuzzier it would become, because the gaps between recorded observations would be wider, the evidence thinner, the ability to connect cause and effect more tenuous. Major historical events would have clear before and after states, but the transition between them would be missing, lost in the darkness of sleep. Revolutions would have a beginning and an end, but the actual fighting, the actual upheaval, the actual moment when power shifted, all of that would have occurred while everyone involved was unconscious. Historians would study the aftermath and try to imagine what must have happened, but they would never know for certain. History would become a kind of forensic science, piecing together a story from evidence, always aware that the true story happened in a realm no human consciousness could access. Museums would struggle to stay relevant, since artifacts could shift meaning overnight as history advanced unseen. Imagine curating a museum in this world. You carefully arrange an exhibition about ancient civilizations, placing artifacts in context, writing descriptions that explain their significance. And then you sleep. And when you wake, time has passed, maybe years, maybe decades. New discoveries have been made while you slept. The context has changed. The story you were telling is now outdated or worse, incorrect. The artifacts haven't changed, but everything around them has, and meaning is contextual. Museums would have to be constantly recurated, constantly updated, because the relationship between the present and the past would keep shifting with each sleep. An artifact that seemed important yesterday might be rendered trivial by new information that emerged overnight. A narrative that made sense before you slept might be completely overturned by historical events that occurred while time was moving and you were not there to witness them. And the visitors to these museums would experience the same disconnection. They would look at ancient pottery or old paintings and try to imagine the world those objects came from. But that world would feel impossibly distant, not just in years but in experience time. There would be so many gaps, so many missing pieces, so many sleeps between now and then that the past would feel less like a different time and more like a different reality entirely. One that operated under rules no one alive could fully understand because no one could experience the journey from there to here. Archives would replace memories, becoming the primary way humanity remembers its own existence. National archives, digital databases, vast storage facilities filled with records. These would become the true memory of civilization. Not the collective human memory, because humans couldn't remember what they never experienced, but the documented, recorded, archived evidence of time's passage. Every society would pour enormous resources into maintaining these archives, because without them, they would have no history at all. Just a collection of people in a frozen present, with no verifiable past and no way to prove that anything before this waking moment ever actually happened. Children would be taught to trust the archives more than stories, more than oral tradition, more than the accounts of elders, because the archives would be objective in a way that human memory could not be. The archives wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't confuse events, wouldn't conflate different waking periods or misremember the sequence of jumps through time. The archives would simply record, this was observed, then sleep occurred, then this was observed. Fact after fact after fact, building a skeleton of history that had no flesh, no lived experience, but at least had structure. At least had some claim to the truth. Generational stories would feel incomplete, since elders could not describe how the world slowly became what it is. In our reality, older generations pass down stories of gradual change. They remember when their neighborhood looked different, when technology was simpler, when social norms were different. They can describe the slow evolution of culture, the way attitudes shifted over years, the incremental changes that added up to transformation. But their elders would have no such stories. They would remember individual frozen moments from their youth, but they wouldn't remember the transitions. They couldn't tell you how the world changed because they were asleep when it changed. An elderly person might remember their childhood home vividly, and they might see the modern city that replaced it, but they couldn't describe the demolition, the construction, the gradual expansion of the urban landscape, because all of that happened while they were unconscious. They could tell you it was different, but not how it became different. They could show you old photographs, but they couldn't provide the narrative thread that connects past to present, because they never experienced that thread. It was cut into pieces by sleep, and the pieces don't quite fit together anymore. This would create a strange generational disconnect. Young people asking elders, what was it like? And elders struggling to answer, because what was it like to live through change they never witnessed? How do you describe experiencing history when you slept through all the moments when history actually happened? Civilizations might reset their myths regularly, unable to trace their origins clearly through unseen time. Mythology usually serves to explain origins, to provide a narrative for how things came to be. But their origins would be genuinely mysterious. How did this civilization begin? No one knows. It was before anyone currently alive started waking and sleeping. How did this city form? Unclear. It must have been built during many sleeps, but no one watched it being built. Where did this tradition come from? Lost to time. It exists now, and there's evidence it existed before, but the moment of its creation, the reason for its existence, those are buried in the unseen past. So societies might regularly reinvent their origin stories, creating new myths to fill the void left by unknowable history. Every few generations, the myths would shift, would be reinterpreted, would be rewritten to make sense to people who have no way to verify what actually happened. The myths wouldn't be lies exactly, but they wouldn't be truth either. They would be best guesses, narrative structures imposed on a past that refuses to reveal itself, stories told to make the present feel less untethered from everything that came before. And these myths would change rapidly because without the anchor of lived historical experience, there would be nothing to stop them from drifting, evolving, transforming with each generation that tried to make sense of a past they couldn't access and a present they couldn't connect to it. Legacy would be measured by what remains understandable after long gaps of unconscious time. If you wanted to leave something behind, something that would last, you couldn't rely on memory or oral tradition or the continuity of culture. You would have to create something so clear, so explicit, so thoroughly documented that it could survive countless sleeps, countless jumps forward in time, countless moments when the world moved on without anyone watching. Instructions would need to be exhaustively detailed. Art would need to be self-explanatory. Messages to the future would need to assume no shared context, no common understanding, because time would erode context faster than decay could erode stone. The greatest works of any civilization would be those that could speak across the gaps, that could communicate to people separated not just by years, but by the unknowable changes that occurred while everyone was asleep. Legacy would be measured by clarity, by explicitness, by the ability to transcend the fundamental disconnect between one waking moment and another. The past would feel reconstructed rather than remembered. And ultimately, That's what history would become in this world. Not a memory, but a reconstruction. A hypothesis built from evidence. A story told about fragments, trying to make sense of a picture where most of the pieces are missing and the ones that remain don't quite fit together. Every generation would look at the records, the photographs, the artifacts, and try to imagine what happened in all those moments when time was moving and consciousness was absent. They would build theories, create narratives, argue about interpretations. But they would never truly know. They would never remember, because you cannot remember what you never experienced. And in this world, almost everything that ever happened occurred while no one was there to experience it. The past would be a foreign country, not because it was far away in time, but because the journey from there to here happened in darkness, in sleep, in the realm of unconsciousness where human awareness cannot follow. And so the past would remain forever mysterious, forever reconstructed, forever just beyond the reach of genuine understanding. A ghost of time that passed without witnesses, leaving only shadows and echoes for the waking world to puzzle over. In a world where time only moves during sleep, the structures that hold society together, work, economy, government, power, would all become strange and unstable, fundamentally transformed by the disconnect between effort and outcome, between action and consequence. Careers would advance in sudden shifts, with promotions, failures, or entire industries rising and falling between two periods of wakefulness. Imagine dedicating your waking hours to your job, working diligently, completing projects, and building relationships with colleagues. And then you sleep, and when you wake, everything has changed. Maybe you've been promoted, but you didn't experience the decision being made, didn't have the conversation with your boss, didn't feel the gradual recognition of your work building over time. You simply wake up one morning and discover that your title is different. Your office has changed. Your responsibilities have expanded. Or perhaps the opposite, you wake to find you've been fired, your position eliminated, your access revoked. And you have no memory of the process, no understanding of what led to this outcome, because it all happened while time was moving and you were not there to witness it. Entire industries could vanish overnight. You might go to sleep working in a thriving sector, technology, manufacturing, whatever it might be, and wake to find that your entire field has become obsolete. New innovations emerged while you slept, markets shifted, consumer demands changed, and the career you've built your waking life around no longer exists. Or perhaps the opposite. A new industry springs up fully formed during one period of sleep, creating opportunities that didn't exist before, requiring skills you haven't developed because you couldn't see them coming. There would be no way to navigate your career strategically, no way to read the signs and adapt gradually. Just sudden shifts, jarring changes, a professional life that felt less like climbing a ladder and more like being teleported randomly up and down a building, never quite sure which floor you'll find yourself on when you open your eyes. Education would rely heavily on memory rather than experience, because learning progress would happen without the sensation of time passing. Think about how we learn now. We practice, we struggle, we try, fail, try again, and gradually improve. We can feel ourselves getting better over time, can sense the moment when something clicks, when understanding dawns. But there, learning wouldn't feel like a process. You would study while awake, absorbing information, practicing skills in a world frozen in time. And then you would sleep. And when you woke, you would discover whether the learning had taken hold. Maybe you would wake up fluent in a language you were studying, the neural pathways carved out while you slept, time allowing your brain to consolidate the information you'd been feeding it during waking hours. Or maybe you'd wake to find you'd forgotten everything, the learning lost because something went wrong during the unconscious hours when your brain was supposed to be processing. You wouldn't be able to feel yourself improving gradually. Just the sudden discovery each morning. Am I better at this today, or worse? Has time been kind to my efforts, or has it erased them? Teachers would become more like coaches preparing athletes for a competition they'll never see, giving students tools and techniques during waking hours and hoping that when sleep comes, time will transform those tools into actual skills. Education would be an act of faith, a gamble that the work done in frozen time will bear fruit in the moving time that students never consciously experience. Economies would operate in sudden shifts, with wealth appearing or vanishing after sleep rather than changing through visible transactions. The stock market wouldn't be something you could watch fluctuate throughout the day. You couldn't observe prices rising and falling, couldn't time your trades, couldn't react to market movements in real time. Instead, you would check the market while awake, seeing frozen numbers, unchanging values, and then sleep. And when you woke, you would discover what time had done to your investments. Maybe you're wealthy now, maybe you're ruined, maybe the numbers barely changed, or maybe the entire economy restructured itself while everyone was unconscious. You would have no control, no ability to respond to changes as they happened, because they only happened when you weren't there to respond. Wealth would feel like luck, like a lottery that plays out each night, distributing and redistributing resources according to rules that operate beyond the reach of conscious decision-making. Poverty and prosperity would both arrive suddenly, without warning, without the gradual accumulation or erosion that at least provides some sense of causation in our current world. Someone might go to sleep comfortably and wake to find they've lost everything. A market crashed, an investment failed, a currency collapsed, all the while time moved and consciousness was absent. The economic anxiety would be profound because you couldn't protect yourself through vigilance or planning. You could only hope that when you slept, time would be generous with your finances. Work would feel disconnected from reward, because effort made while awake would only show results after unconscious time had passed. This might be one of the most psychologically challenging aspects of this reality. We're accustomed to cause and effect, to the idea that hard work leads to results. But the connection between work and reward would be severed by the gap of unconsciousness. You would labor during your waking hours, planting seeds, writing code, building structures, whatever your work might be. But you would never see the direct results of your efforts. You would plant the seeds and then sleep, waking to find either a flourishing garden or withered soil, with no experience of the growing process, no ability to nurture or adjust, no feedback loop between your actions and their outcomes. You would write code and release it into the frozen world, then sleep, waking to discover whether it worked or failed, whether it was adopted or ignored, with no opportunity to debug in real time, no ability to respond to how it performed. This would erode the psychological satisfaction that comes from work. Because work feels meaningful partly because we can see it maturing, can watch our efforts translate into results. But that translation would happen in the dark, in the unseen hours, and you would only ever encounter the finished product, never the process. You would become divorced from the consequences of your own actions, living in a world where you make choices but never truly witness their unfolding, where you act but never see yourself acting upon the world. Governments would fear mass sleep events because synchronized unconsciousness could push the world forward uncontrollably. Imagine if everyone in a city, a country, or the entire world decided to sleep at the same time. Time would move forward for all of them simultaneously, in the same increment. History would leap ahead in one massive jump, with no one awake to observe, no one conscious to intervene, no one able to slow down or stop whatever changes occurred during that synchronized sleep. This would terrify those in power because it would mean losing control entirely. If everyone sleeps together, then everyone experiences the same jump through time, and whatever happens during that jump is completely ungoverned, completely unwitnessed, completely beyond the reach of human authority. Wars could start and end. Cities could rise or fall. Governments could topple and reform. And no one would know until they all woke together and discovered what time had done. So governments would almost certainly try to prevent synchronized sleep, mandating staggered sleep schedules, requiring different groups to sleep at different times, ensuring that consciousness was always distributed across the population so that time moved in smaller, more manageable increments rather than massive, uncontrollable leaps. Sleep schedules would be regulated, monitored, enforced. Going to sleep at the wrong time might be illegal, a threat to social stability, a dangerous act of letting too much history happen at once. Power would shift toward those who control sleep schedules, quietly deciding when history is allowed to progress. And this is where the truly sinister possibilities emerge. Because if sleep is the mechanism that allows time to move, then whoever controls when people sleep controls the pace of history itself. Imagine a ruling class that decides when different populations are allowed to rest, strategically managing who sleeps when to ensure that time moves in ways that benefit those in power. They might keep certain groups awake longer, freezing them in disadvantageous circumstances, preventing their lives from advancing while others sleep and progress. They might orchestrate sleep schedules so that their own allies experience more subjective time, more opportunity, more advancement, while their opponents are kept in a kind of temporal stasis, sleeping rarely, experiencing few jumps forward, aging more slowly but also achieving less, building less, accumulating less. Sleep would become a tool of oppression, a mechanism of control more powerful than any weapon, because it would control reality itself. And this control would be subtle, insidious. It wouldn't look like tyranny from the outside, just careful management of rest schedules for public health and safety. But underneath, it would be the ultimate expression of power, the ability to decide who gets to participate in history and who gets left behind in frozen moments while the world moves on without them. Records of debt, ownership, and identity would need constant verification, because reality itself could update during sleep. How do you prove you own something when ownership could change while you're unconscious? How do you enforce a contract when the terms, the parties, or the entire context could transform during a single night's sleep? Every legal system would require constant re-verification, constant checking and double-checking to ensure that what was true before sleep is still true after. Property records would need to be confirmed each waking period. Is this still my house? Is this still my land? Did time and changing circumstances transfer ownership while I was asleep? Debts would be equally uncertain. Do I still owe this money? Has the debt been paid somehow during the hours when time moved? Has the creditor died, been replaced, forgotten? Identity itself would need verification. Are you still who you claim to be? Has so much time passed during sleep that you're legally a different person now? Aged beyond recognition, your previous identity expired? Bureaucracy would expand enormously. Entire industries dedicated solely to maintaining continuity across the gaps created by sleep. Notaries, verifiers, record keepers, identity specialists, all working constantly to document the state of things before sleep and compare it to the state of things after, trying to maintain some thread of legal and social continuity in a world where reality keeps updating without warning. Society might measure stability not by growth or peace, but by how little changes after each night. The ideal would shift. Instead of celebrating progress, advancement, development, societies might begin to value stasis. The best governments would be those that kept change minimal, that ensured when you woke up, the world was as similar as possible to the world you left behind when you closed your eyes. Change would be frightening, destabilizing, a sign that control had been lost. Political campaigns might run on promises of stability. Vote for me, and when you wake, things will be almost exactly as they were. Under my leadership, we've reduced the average change per sleep by 15%. Success would be measured not by innovation or improvement, but by preservation, by how effectively the society could resist time's transformative effects, by how well it could keep the world frozen in a desirable state even as sleep kept allowing time to push it forward. This would create a fundamentally conservative society, one that fears the future not because of what might happen, but because the future can only arrive through unconsciousness, through surrender, through a loss of control that makes every tomorrow feel like an invasion rather than a progression. The idea of progress would become philosophical rather than practical. Because how do you pursue progress when you can't experience it happening? How do you work toward a better future when the future only arrives while you're asleep, and you have no control over what it looks like when it gets here? Progress would stop being a practical goal, something you achieve through effort and planning, and become instead a philosophical concept, a hope, a prayer almost. You could work toward it while awake, but whether that work actually led to progress would only be revealed after sleep, and by then you couldn't take any credit for it. Time did it, not you. You were just unconscious while it happened. Philosophers might argue about whether progress even exists in a world where no one experiences time passing. Maybe what we call progress is just random change, history moving forward without direction or purpose, and we impose meaning on it after the fact, looking at the before and after and telling ourselves a story about how one led to the other. But we don't know. We can't know. Because we weren't there. We were asleep. The future would feel negotiated, not built. And in the end, that's what society would become. A constant negotiation with time, with sleep, with the unknowable forces that operate while consciousness is absent. You couldn't build the future through effort and determination. You could only negotiate with it, offering your waking hours as a kind of bargaining chip, hoping that when you surrendered to sleep and allowed time to move, it would move in directions you could live with. Communities would develop rituals, customs, unspoken agreements about how to approach sleep, what to do during waking hours, how to prepare for the jumps forward through time. Families would talk before bed, discussing what they hoped to wake up to, as if speaking it aloud might somehow influence what time would do while they were gone. Societies would create elaborate preparations, setting the stage as carefully as possible before sleep, hoping that the frozen world they left behind would guide time toward desirable outcomes when it started moving again. But it would all be negotiation, superstition almost, because ultimately, no one could control what happened while they slept. They could only hope, prepare, negotiate with the darkness, and wake each morning to discover whether their negotiations had been successful, whether time had been kind, whether the world they found was one they could accept, or whether they would need to start negotiating all over again, setting the stage for the next sleep, the next jump, the next surrender to forces beyond conscious control. This is society in a world where time only moves during sleep, fractured, anxious, negotiating constantly with an uncertain future, measuring success by minimal change, and learning to accept that power belongs not to those who act, but to those who control when others are allowed to rest, when history is permitted to progress, when the future is allowed to arrive. In a world where time only moves when you're asleep, the very foundations of law, trust, and morality would become unstable, shifting like sand beneath the feet of anyone trying to build a just and ethical society. Laws and contracts would feel unstable, since long-term consequences of decisions would only reveal themselves after nights of unconsciousness. Think about what a contract means in our world. It's an agreement that binds parties over time, with the understanding that actions taken now will have predictable consequences later. But there, the later would be fundamentally unknowable at the moment of signing. You might enter into a business agreement, a marriage contract, a promise to repay a loan. You would make these commitments during your waking hours, in the frozen present where everything feels solid and certain. But then you would sleep, and when you woke, you would discover what time had made your agreement. Perhaps the business partner aged 20 years overnight and died, leaving the contract in limbo. Perhaps the marriage was tested by events you never witnessed, stresses and changes that occurred while you were unconscious. Perhaps the economy shifted so dramatically during sleep that the loan is now either worthless or impossible to repay. Lawyers would struggle to draft contracts that could account for these gaps in consciousness, these jumps through time that could render any agreement obsolete or transform its meaning entirely. How do you write terms and conditions when the conditions themselves could change beyond recognition during a single night's sleep? How do you plan for contingencies when you can't even predict how much time will pass before the next waking moment? The law would have to become flexible, adaptive, filled with clauses acknowledging that reality itself is unstable, that agreements are subject not just to the actions of the parties involved, but to the unknowable changes that time brings while everyone is unconscious. Crime investigations would struggle, since causes and consequences could be separated by nights of missing time. Imagine being a detective trying to solve a crime in this world. You arrive at a scene, evidence of wrongdoing, a victim, clear signs that something terrible happened. But when did it happen? During someone's waking hours, in that frozen moment when nothing could actually change. That seems impossible, because crimes require action, movement, and time passing. So it must have happened during sleep, during one of those periods when time was moving and no one was conscious to witness it. But whose sleep? How many people slept between the last time everything was normal and the moment the crime was discovered? If 5 people slept at different times, then there are 5 possible windows when the crime could have occurred, 5 separate periods when time was moving. And you can't interview witnesses about what they saw, because no one was awake during any of those periods. The crime happened in the dark, in the gaps, in the realm where consciousness cannot follow. Evidence would be your only guide, but even evidence becomes questionable when time moves in jumps. Is this fingerprint from the crime, or from weeks ago? How can you tell? Did this damage occur during the relevant sleep period, or during a different one? The chain of causation that detective work relies on would be broken into fragments, scattered across multiple periods of unconsciousness, impossible to assemble into a coherent timeline because the timeline itself is missing most of its pieces. Some crimes might never be solved, not because evidence is lacking, but because the fundamental structure of time makes it impossible to connect actions to consequences, to trace the line from cause to effect when that line is interrupted by sleep, cut into segments that don't quite align. Justice systems might pause all verdicts until after sleep, believing that time itself must move before truth can be revealed. Courts might develop a strange ritual, hearing all the evidence, listening to arguments, allowing judges and juries to deliberate while awake, but not rendering a verdict. Not yet. Instead, everyone involved would be required to sleep first, to allow time to move, to give reality a chance to shift and settle before proclaiming what is true and what is just. There would be a superstitious element to this, a belief that truth exists in time, not in the frozen present, and therefore cannot be determined until time has been allowed to pass. Perhaps the thinking would be that sleep brings clarity, that the unconscious hours allow facts to arrange themselves properly, allow justice to reveal itself in ways it cannot while everything is frozen. Or perhaps it would be more practical, a recognition that any verdict delivered in the waking moment would be based on incomplete information, because so much happens during sleep that could change the context, alter the meaning, transform what seemed like clear guilt or innocence into something far more ambiguous. Regardless of the reasoning, imagine the anxiety of waiting for a verdict, knowing that you must sleep before learning your fate, knowing that when you wake, not only will the decision be revealed, but time will have passed, the world will have changed, and you yourself might be different in ways you can't predict or control. Justice would feel less like a process and more like a leap of faith, trusting that when you emerge from unconsciousness, truth will have found its way to the surface. Trust would become fragile, as relationships could change overnight without any observable warning signs. How do you maintain trust in another person when they could fundamentally change every time they sleep? When their feelings, their circumstances, their very identity could shift during the hours when time moves and you're not there to see it happen. In our world, we build trust gradually, through consistent behavior over time, through patterns we can observe and come to rely on. But there would be no gradual building, no consistent behavior, because consistency requires continuous time, and continuous time doesn't exist in waking experience. You might trust someone completely before going to sleep. You've known them for what feels like years of waking moments. They've been reliable, honest, caring. And then you sleep. And when you wake, they're different. Not because they chose to betray you necessarily, but because time moved them in a direction you didn't witness, changed their circumstances in ways that altered who they are, introduced experiences into their life that transformed their perspective, their priorities, their feelings about you. And you have no warning, no signs to read, no gradual cooling of affection, no slowly building resentment that you could have addressed. Just the sudden discovery that the person you trusted is no longer the person they were, and you weren't there for the transformation, so you can't understand it, can't make sense of it, can't do anything but accept that time has taken someone from you and replaced them with a stranger wearing a familiar face. Friendships, romances, family bonds, all would carry this fragility, this awareness that every sleep is a risk, a chance that when you wake, the relationship will have evolved or dissolved in ways beyond your control. Trust would be something you give knowing it might be rendered meaningless overnight, a gift offered to someone who might not even exist anymore by morning. Moral responsibility would feel blurred, since outcomes would occur while people were not conscious to witness them. This raises profound ethical questions. Are you responsible for consequences you never witnessed? If you make a decision during your waking hours and then you sleep, and during that sleep time moves forward and your decision leads to harm, are you morally culpable for that harm? You intended the action, but you didn't experience its effects, didn't see it unfolding, had no opportunity to intervene or correct course. In our world, we generally hold people responsible for the foreseeable consequences of their actions. But their foreseeability becomes almost impossible because you can't predict how much time will pass during sleep, what other factors will emerge during those unconscious hours, how the context will shift. You might make what seems like a harmless choice, sleep for what feels like a moment, and wake to discover it caused catastrophic harm because time moved in ways you couldn't have anticipated, because events occurred during your unconsciousness that transformed your benign action into something terrible. Would philosophers argue that you're still responsible, that intention matters more than witness? Or would they say that responsibility requires consciousness, that you can't truly be blamed for consequences that occurred in a realm you can never access, during time you never experienced? The debate would rage, and different legal systems, different cultures, different ethical frameworks would arrive at different answers. But everyone would agree on one thing: moral responsibility in this world is nothing like moral responsibility in ours, because the connection between action and outcome has been severed by the gap of unconsciousness. Some individuals might feel morally detached, believing that anything happening during sleep is not truly their responsibility. And this is where things get dark. Because if you truly believed that you're only responsible for what happens during your waking hours, during the frozen moments when nothing can actually change, then you could rationalize almost anything. You could make decisions knowing they would lead to harm, but telling yourself it doesn't matter because the harm would only manifest during sleep, during time's movement, during a period when you weren't conscious and therefore weren't truly acting. This could create a kind of moral nihilism, a belief that nothing you do while awake really matters because all actual consequences occur in the darkness beyond consciousness. Why worry about ethics? Why try to do good? The waking world is frozen, unchanging. The real world, the world where things happen and consequences unfold, is the world of sleep, and you're not there for it, so how can you be accountable? Some people might embrace this detachment as a kind of freedom, liberating themselves from moral anxiety by simply denying responsibility for anything that happens outside their conscious experience. Others would find it horrifying, an abandonment of ethics that could justify any cruelty, any selfishness, because the person committing the act would never have to witness its results, would never feel the weight of the harm they caused. Promises would feel heavier, as you could never know how much the world might change before you were awake again. Every promise would carry extraordinary weight, because you would be binding yourself across an unknowable gulf of time. When you promise to meet someone, to be there for them, to keep a commitment, you're making that promise in the present moment. But the fulfillment of the promise exists in the future, and the future only arrives through sleep, through time you cannot experience or control. You might promise to care for someone and then sleep and wake to find that decades have passed, that the person you promised to care for is now elderly or dead, that you failed the promise not through any choice of your own but simply because time moved differently than you expected. Or you might promise something small, something simple, and wake to find that the context has changed so completely that keeping the promise is now impossible or meaningless. And yet promises would still be made, perhaps more solemnly than ever, because in a world this uncertain, this unstable, the act of promising would be one of the few ways to assert meaning, to claim that despite all the chaos and disconnection, your word still means something, that you're binding yourself to a future you can't see or control because that's what it means to be human, to be ethical, to care about something beyond the frozen present moment. Promises would become sacred acts, weighted with the knowledge that you're reaching across the void of unconsciousness, trying to connect your present self to a future self in a future world that you'll never experience arriving, only discover already arrived. Grief would feel disorienting, as loss would often be realized only upon waking, without the slow process of goodbye. In our world, loss is often gradual. We watch people decline, have time to prepare, say our goodbyes over days or weeks. Even sudden losses are processed in real time. We experience the shock, the immediate aftermath, the first waves of grief. But their loss would almost always be a discovery, something you wake up to rather than something you experience happening. You would say goodnight to someone you love, close your eyes, and open them to find they're gone. Died while you slept, while time was moving and you were absent. There would be no goodbye, no final conversation, no chance to say the things you meant to say. Just their presence one moment, and their absence the next, with an unknowable span of time between where they lived and died and were mourned by others and buried or burned or remembered, all while you were unconscious, oblivious, still existing in the moment when they were alive. The grief would be compounded by this temporal dislocation. You wouldn't just be mourning the person, you'd be mourning all the time you lost, all the moments that happened without you, all the process of loss and grieving that others experienced while you were frozen in a moment before knowledge, before pain, before the world became a place without this person in it. And you would feel cheated, in a way. Cheated of the opportunity to grieve in real time, to process the loss as it unfolded. Instead, you would be presented with completed grief, finished loss, a fait accompli that you had no part in creating or experiencing. The person is gone, and you must simply accept it, even though for you, subjectively, they were alive just a moment ago, just before you closed your eyes. Funerals might be delayed until after sleep, as people wait for time itself to acknowledge the loss. Because how can you have a funeral in the frozen present, when nothing has really changed yet, when time hasn't actually moved to carry the person away? Some societies might develop the practice of waiting, keeping the body, delaying the ceremony until everyone involved has slept at least once, allowing time to pass, allowing the death to become real in the way that things only become real when time has moved around them. The funeral would then be held in a world that has genuinely lost the person, where time has progressed beyond the moment of their death, where the absence has had time to settle into reality. It would be a way of honoring both the loss and the strange temporality of existence, acknowledging that death, like everything else, only truly happens in the darkness of sleep, in the movement of time that consciousness cannot access. These delayed funerals would be solemn affairs, weighted not just with grief but with the knowledge that everyone present has slept and woken, has experienced the jump through time, has emerged into a world where the deceased is definitively, temporally gone, not just frozen in death but actually absent, separated from the living by the passage of time that sleep allowed. Ethics would exist without witnesses, and this might be the most profound moral challenge of all. In our world, ethics partly exist because we observe consequences, because we see cause and effect, because we witness the results of our choices and adjust our behavior accordingly. But most consequences would occur without witnesses, in the realm of moving time where no consciousness exists to observe them. People would make choices, and those choices would have effects, and those effects would unfold entirely during sleep, entirely in the darkness, entirely without anyone there to see them happen. Ethics would become abstract, theoretical, a set of principles you follow not because you see them working but because you believe they should work, even in the unseen realm, even in the time you cannot access. Some would argue this makes ethics purer, more genuinely moral, because you're doing right without the reward of witnessing the good results. You're being ethical in a void, choosing good for its own sake rather than for any observable benefit. Others would say it makes ethics meaningless, that morality requires feedback, requires the ability to see consequences and learn from them, and without that feedback loop, without witnesses, ethics becomes just a set of empty gestures performed in a frozen world that cannot actually be changed by your waking actions. The truth would probably lie somewhere between. Ethics would exist, people would try to be good, would try to make choices they believed were right. But those choices would feel tenuous, uncertain, disconnected from any observable outcome. You would do what you thought was right and then sleep, and wake to a world that had been shaped partly by your choices but mostly by time's unknowable movements, and you would never really know if your ethics mattered, if your goodness made any difference, if morality means anything in a universe that only changes when no one is watching. This is law, trust, and morality in a world where time only moves during sleep. A world where justice is deferred, where relationships are fragile, where responsibility is blurred, where promises are weighted with impossible futures, where grief arrives without warning, and where ethics must exist without the comfort of witnesses, without the reassurance of observable consequences, practiced in good faith in a frozen world, hoping that somehow, in the darkness of sleep, in the movement of time, that consciousness cannot follow, goodness still matters, truth still exists, and morality still has meaning even when no one is there to see it unfold. In a world where time only moves when you're asleep, perhaps nowhere would the strangeness be felt more acutely than in the human mind itself, in the sense of who you are, in the continuity of identity that we take for granted but which would become profoundly unstable. Mindfulness would become paradoxical, since being fully present would also mean holding the universe still. There's a certain irony, almost cruel, in this arrangement. In our world, mindfulness practices encourage us to be fully present, to inhabit the current moment completely, to pay attention to the here and now. And this is considered a path to peace, to connection with reality. But there, being fully present would mean something else entirely. It would mean freezing the universe, stopping time, holding everything in stasis through the sheer act of your awareness. The more mindful you become, the more completely you inhabit the present moment, the more you would be preventing reality from moving forward, from changing, from being anything other than this single frozen instant. Mindfulness would become an act of cosmic resistance, a way of gripping the universe and refusing to let it breathe. And what would that do to your mind? Would you feel powerful, knowing that your consciousness alone was keeping everything suspended? Or would you feel the weight of it, the terrible responsibility, the knowledge that everything and everyone is trapped because you're paying attention? Some people might seek mindfulness desperately, trying to hold on to precious moments by staying as conscious as possible, as present as possible. Others might fear it, might try to scatter their attention, to think about the past or future, to be anywhere but here, because being here means nothing can happen, nothing can change, nothing can move toward whatever comes next. The paradox would be inescapable. The very practice meant to connect you to reality would instead disconnect you from the only version of reality where things actually happen, where time flows, where existence unfolds. You would have to choose, be present and freeze the world, or surrender presence and allow the world to continue without you. Identity would feel unstable, as versions of yourself would disappear every time you slept. Who are you really in a world like this? In our reality, identity has continuity. You are the same person you were yesterday, connected by an unbroken thread of experienced time. You remember yesterday becoming today, remember living through the hours that connected them. But that thread would be cut over and over every time you slept. Every time you closed your eyes and allowed time to move, the version of you that went to sleep would be gone, dissolved into the past, and a new version would wake in a changed world. Yes, you would have memories. Yes, you would have the same name, the same basic personality structures. But would you truly be the same person? Or would you be a successor, an inheritor of a life that someone else, some previous version of you, began? You might wake with memories of making plans, but you didn't experience executing them. That was done by future you, a version of yourself that existed during the moving time while you were unconscious. Are their actions your actions? Are their choices your choices? Or are you just living with the consequences of decisions made by someone who happens to share your memories but whom you never actually were? This question would haunt people. Parents would look at their children and wonder which version is looking back at them. Lovers would embrace and question whether the person they're holding is the same person they fell asleep next to, or a different iteration, separated by unknowable experiences that occurred during sleep. You would look in the mirror each morning and wonder, is this me, or is this someone new, born in the moment of waking, carrying memories that feel like mine but might belong to someone who no longer exists? Regret would feel delayed, because consequences would only surface after unconsciousness. Imagine making a mistake, a poor choice, saying something you shouldn't have said during your waking hours. In our world, you might feel regret immediately or soon after as you observe the consequences unfolding. But there, you wouldn't see the consequences. Not right away. You would make your mistake in the frozen moment, where it couldn't yet cause harm, and then you would sleep. And when you woke, you would discover what your mistake had wrought during the hours when time was moving and you were not there to witness it. The regret would hit you all at once, without warning, without preparation. You would wake from sleep and immediately be confronted with the full weight of what you did wrong, with no gradual build-up, no time to steel yourself. The mistake would be in the past, separated from you by the gap of unconsciousness, and yet the consequences would be immediate, present, demanding your attention and response. You would have to cope with regret for something that feels both recent and distant, something you remember doing but that happened in what feels like a different lifetime, before sleep erased continuity and deposited you in this new moment where the damage is already done. And because the consequences would be delayed, separated from the action by sleep, the learning process would be disrupted. You couldn't immediately connect cause and effect, couldn't feel the natural feedback loop that helps us learn from mistakes. Instead, you would live with perpetual anxiety, knowing that any mistake you make during waking hours is waiting, dormant, ready to bloom into consequences during the next period of sleep, and you won't know how bad those consequences are until you wake and discover what time has done with your poor choices. People might begin to feel like visitors in their own lives, waking into outcomes they did not experience. This sense of disconnection would grow over time, accumulating with each sleep, each jump through time, each morning when you wake to find your life has progressed without you. You would start to feel like you're not really living your own life, but rather touring it, visiting outcomes that someone else achieved, problems that someone else created, relationships that someone else built or destroyed. Your career would advance and you would accept the promotions, but they wouldn't feel earned because you didn't experience the work that led to them. That happened during sleep, during time's movement, performed by some version of you that you have no conscious memory of being. Your children would grow and you would love them, but they would feel slightly alien because you didn't experience their growing, didn't witness the 1,000 small moments that transformed an infant into a child, into a teenager, into an adult. You just woke up repeatedly to find them different, aged, changed by time you didn't live through. You would be a stranger in your own life, perpetually arriving late to events that have already concluded, forever trying to catch up to a present that keeps moving forward without you every time you close your eyes. Some people might embrace this, might find freedom in the disconnection, treating each waking period as a fresh start, a chance to encounter their life anew without the burden of having lived through all the difficult moments. Others would find it unbearable, a kind of existential homelessness, always seeking a sense of ownership over a life that keeps happening to them rather than being lived by them. Therapy would focus on reconciling memory gaps rather than processing lived experiences. Imagine sitting in a therapist's office in this world. You wouldn't talk about your childhood the way we do, with narratives of experiences, of events you remember living through. Instead, you would talk about fragments, disconnected moments separated by sleep, by gaps in time that you crossed without experiencing. The therapist wouldn't help you process trauma by walking you through the memory of it, because you wouldn't have a memory of most traumatic events. They would have happened during sleep, during moving time, and you would only have the aftermath, the scars, the changed behavior, the emotional residue left by experiences you never consciously had. Therapy would become an archaeological practice, digging through the gaps, trying to reconstruct what must have happened during all those periods of unconsciousness based on the evidence of how you changed, what you fear, what you avoid, what triggers your anxiety. The therapist would say, something must have happened during this period between sleeps because you went to sleep feeling one way and woke feeling another. Let's try to imagine what it might have been, even though you weren't there to experience it. And you would work together to create hypothetical narratives, stories about the gaps, best guesses about what time did to you while you were unconscious. These stories might not be true, might not reflect what actually happened, but they would be the only way to make sense of a self that keeps changing for reasons you cannot access, in moments you cannot remember because you weren't conscious to form the memories in the first place. Some people might fear losing their sense of self more than death, because sleep repeatedly dissolves continuity. Death, at least, would be final. It would be one last sleep from which you don't wake, one final jump through time that has no landing. But this constant dissolution of self, this repeated loss of continuity every time you sleep, might feel worse than death to some people. Because you would die, in a sense, every night. The you that closes your eyes would not be the you that opens them. They would share memories, share a body, share a name, but the continuous conscious experience that makes you feel like a singular you would be broken, interrupted, restarted over and over. You would live a series of lives, each one brief, each one ending in sleep and being replaced by the next iteration. And you would know this. You would be aware that every time you close your eyes, you're ending and someone else, some future version who inherits your memories but isn't quite you, will wake up and continue on. This knowledge might create a profound fear of sleep, not because of what happens in the world while you're unconscious, but because of what happens to you. Each sleep is a small death, a dissolution of the self, and even though a new self wakes up, it's not quite the same self, and the continuous you, the one who experiences this moment right now, ends when the eyes close. Some philosophers might argue this happens to us in our current reality too, that we're constantly changing, constantly becoming new people, and the continuity is an illusion. But there, it wouldn't be an illusion. It would be an obvious, undeniable fact. You would feel the discontinuity every morning, would wake with the knowledge that you're not quite who you were, that time has moved you forward in ways you didn't experience, that the person who fell asleep is gone and you're the replacement, carrying their memories like inherited luggage. Names and identities could change between sleeps, making personal history feel negotiable rather than fixed. If identity is already unstable, if you're becoming a different version of yourself every time you sleep, then why not acknowledge it formally? Some societies might develop naming practices where people take new names after significant sleeps, marking the transition from one version of self to another. You might wake up and decide you're no longer who you were, that enough has changed during sleep that you deserve a new name, a new identity, a fresh start. Personal history would become fluid, negotiable. The facts would remain: you were born, you did certain things, you existed in certain places. But the interpretation, the meaning, the story you tell about who you are, that would be constantly revised. Each waking period would offer a chance to reinterpret the past, to tell a different story about the fragmented experiences that make up your life. One morning you might wake and frame your past as a story of growth and achievement. The next morning, after a long sleep, you might wake and frame the same past as a story of loss and missed opportunities. Both would be true, both would be valid, because the past is just a collection of disconnected moments, and the narrative that connects them is something you create, something you negotiate with yourself each time you wake. Being awake would feel like resistance against reality, because in a fundamental way, that's what wakefulness would be, a refusal to let reality proceed, a holding of the world in stasis, a resistance against time's natural flow. Some people might feel this as a moral burden, a sense that by being awake they're doing something selfish, preventing the universe from moving forward, keeping everyone and everything frozen for their own benefit. Others might feel it as a form of power, the ability to stop time itself just by keeping their eyes open, to assert control over reality through the simple act of remaining conscious. But regardless of how it was interpreted, there would be an underlying sense that being awake is not the natural state, not the way things are supposed to be. Reality wants to move, time wants to flow, the universe wants to progress. And consciousness prevents all of that. Being awake would feel like swimming upstream, like pushing against a current that wants to carry you into sleep, into unconsciousness, into the realm where time can finally move again. Every moment of wakefulness would require effort, not just the biological effort of staying alert, but the existential effort of holding reality still, of being the obstacle that prevents existence from continuing its journey forward. Consciousness would feel temporary. And it is temporary, of course, even in our world. But the temporary nature of consciousness would be profound, obvious, undeniable. You would wake each morning knowing that this conscious experience, this ability to think and perceive and be present, is a brief interruption in the natural flow of time. You exist as a conscious being for a handful of hours, and then you surrender that existence, allow yourself to dissolve back into unconsciousness, and time moves on without you. Consciousness would feel like a candle flame, flickering in the darkness, beautiful and precious but fundamentally unsustainable, destined to be extinguished so that the darkness, the realm of time and change and reality progressing, can return. Some might find this beautiful, might treasure each conscious moment as a rare gift, a brief opportunity to experience existence before surrendering back to the void. Others might find it depressing, might feel that consciousness is too fragile, too temporary to build anything meaningful on, that any sense of self or purpose or meaning constructed during waking hours is doomed to be interrupted, dissolved, reformed countless times until finally it doesn't reform anymore and death arrives as the final sleep. Existence would feel fragmented, and in the end, this might be the most accurate description of life in this world, fragmented existence. Not a continuous stream of experience, not a coherent journey from birth to death, but a collection of fragments, moments of consciousness separated by gulfs of unknowable time, pieces of a puzzle that don't quite fit together because the picture keeps changing between the placement of each piece. You would exist in fragments, experience life in fragments, build identity in fragments, love and work and hope in fragments, always aware that the next sleep will bring another fragment, disconnected from this one, different from this one, separated by time you cannot bridge and experiences you cannot access. Some might find meaning in the fragments themselves, might learn to appreciate each waking moment as complete in itself, not needing connection to what came before or after. Others might spend their lives trying desperately to connect the fragments, to build bridges across the gaps, to create some sense of continuity and coherence in a fragmented existence. But everyone would live with the knowledge that they are not whole, cannot be whole, that wholeness requires continuous time and continuous consciousness, and those things do not exist in a world where time only moves during sleep. This is the mind and identity in a world where time only moves when you're asleep, a world of paradoxical mindfulness, unstable identity, delayed regret, visitor-like existence, therapeutic archaeology, fear of self-loss, negotiable history, consciousness as resistance, temporariness as the fundamental condition, and fragmented existence as the only kind of existence possible. A world where being yourself is a constantly renewed challenge, where each morning brings not just a new day but a new self, and where the question, "Who am I?" has no stable answer, only a series of approximations that change every time you close your eyes and allow time to carry you, unconscious, into whatever version of yourself will wake in the morning. In a world where time only moves when you're asleep, the expressions of human culture, language, art, music, religion, would all be transformed, twisted into strange new forms by the fundamental disconnection between consciousness and time's passage. Language would evolve strangely, because new words would appear fully formed after sleep, without anyone remembering how or why they were created. Think about how language changes in our world. New words emerge gradually through usage, through cultural shifts, through technology creating the need for new terminology. We can trace the evolution, watch slang develop, see words gain and lose meaning over months and years. But their language would change in jumps. You would go to sleep speaking one dialect, using one set of words and phrases, and wake to find the language has shifted. New words exist now, fully formed, already integrated into common usage. But no one remembers coining them. No one witnessed their adoption, their spread through the population. They simply appeared during sleep, during the time when language was free to evolve without conscious speakers, when communication changed in the darkness while everyone was unconscious. You might wake up and hear people using words you don't recognize, expressing concepts that didn't exist in the language when you fell asleep. And when you ask what these words mean, where they came from, people would shrug. They're just here now, part of the language. Maybe they emerged during multiple people's sleep periods, created independently by the natural drift of communication when time was moving. Maybe they evolved from old words in ways no one witnessed. Maybe they appeared for reasons no one can articulate, because the process of their creation occurred in a realm consciousness cannot access. Language would feel alive in an uncanny way, changing and growing and evolving according to its own logic, independent of the people who speak it. You would be at the mercy of your own language, constantly adapting to changes you didn't participate in, learning new ways to express yourself that were invented while you weren't there to invent them. Dictionaries would be updated constantly, becoming less records of how language is used and more discoveries of how language has changed while no one was watching. Music would gain a haunting quality, because rhythm would no longer mirror time. Music, in our world, is fundamentally temporal. It exists in time, moves through time, uses rhythm to create patterns that our brains recognize and respond to. But their rhythm would become strange, almost meaningless, because it would refer to a kind of time that waking consciousness never experiences. You could play a steady beat, tap, 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 but the regularity would be an illusion. The taps would happen in frozen moments, each one identical in its timelessness, and the space between them wouldn't be time passing but simply more frozen moments, stacked together. Musicians would create rhythms knowing that rhythm only truly exists during sleep, during the moving time when the intervals between beats are actual intervals of time passing rather than just a series of still moments arranged to suggest passage. Music would become a kind of prayer, an invocation of the realm of sleep, an attempt to create in sound what cannot be created in waking experience, the flow of time itself. Listeners would find music haunting because it would remind them of what they cannot have while conscious. The experience of moments actually connecting, actually flowing one into another, actually creating the continuity that gives rhythm meaning. Some musical traditions might develop around this, with compositions specifically designed to be set in motion before sleep, programmed to play during the hours when time moves, creating actual rhythm for the sleeping household even though no one would be awake to hear it. The music would play in the darkness, in the realm of moving time, performing its temporal patterns for an audience of sleepers, and when people woke they would only know the music played by the evidence, the recording devices, the notation showing what was performed, the memory of having set it in motion, but they would never have heard it actually happening, never experienced the true rhythm that only exists when consciousness is absent. Art would feel timeless, because paintings and sculptures would never change while being observed. This might seem like a small thing, but it would fundamentally alter the experience of visual art. In our world, when you stand before a painting, you experience time passing while you look at it. The light changes subtly. Your perspective shifts as you move slightly. Your understanding deepens the longer you look. The artwork exists in time, and your observation of it is a temporal experience. But there, a painting would be absolutely frozen while you observed it. The light wouldn't shift. Nothing about the work would change or seem to change. It would exist in perfect, eternal stasis, exactly as it is, for as long as you remained conscious to observe it. Only during sleep would the painting age, would the colors fade, would the canvas deteriorate. You would look at a masterpiece one day, sleep, and wake to find it subtly older, ever so slightly degraded, time having worked on it while you were unconscious, even though from your perspective you just looked at it a moment ago. Artists would create works knowing they would only truly exist, only change, only age, only interact with the environment, during the hours when no one could see them. The art would have a secret life in the darkness, in the realm of moving time, transforming and evolving and slowly falling apart while consciousness was absent. And viewers would see only snapshots of this secret life, frozen moments in the artwork's existence, separated by gaps of unknowable change. Art would become a meditation on impermanence that can never be witnessed, on change that happens only when no one is looking, on the fundamental impossibility of observing the passage of time in the world you inhabit. Fame would feel unstable, with public opinion transforming overnight. Celebrities, public figures, artists, leaders. Anyone who depended on public opinion would live in a state of constant anxiety, because reputation could shift dramatically during a single night's sleep. You might go to bed beloved, the most popular figure in your field, adored by millions, and you might wake to find yourself despised, canceled, forgotten, or replaced by someone new who rose to prominence during the hours when time was moving and public opinion was free to shift without you there to influence it. There would be no way to manage your image carefully over time, no way to slowly rebuild a damaged reputation or gradually increase your popularity. Public opinion would move in jumps, massive shifts occurring during sleep when social dynamics could evolve, when scandals could emerge and spread and be responded to, when entirely new movements could form and declare you their hero or their enemy. You would wake each morning to discover what the public thought of you, with no control over how that opinion formed, no ability to respond to criticisms or capitalize on praise as they developed because they developed in a realm you couldn't access. Fame would be like standing on sand that constantly shifts beneath your feet, never solid, never stable, always liable to transform into something completely different the moment you close your eyes. Some might refuse to seek fame at all, seeing it as too volatile, too disconnected from anything they could control. Others might become addicted to it, constantly checking their status upon waking, obsessively trying to predict what public opinion might do to them during the next sleep, living in fear of the morning when they wake to find they've been forgotten or despised. Vacations would feel unnatural, since traveling would not involve a sense of journey. In our world, travel is temporal. You experience the journey, feel the distance being covered, watch the landscape change as you move through it. A long trip feels long because you experience the time it takes. But there, if you wanted to travel somewhere distant, the journey itself would happen during sleep. You would board a vehicle, a train, a plane, whatever exists in this world, then sleep during the transit. And when you woke, you would have arrived, teleported in your subjective experience from one place to another with no sense of the distance between them. Vacations would lose the quality of escape, of getting away, because getting away wouldn't feel like going anywhere. You would just be in one place, then sleep, then be in another place, and the journey between them would be missing from your experience. The anticipation of arrival, the gradual change of scenery, the sense of distance from home. All of that would be absent, replaced by sudden displacement, jarring transitions from familiar to foreign with no buffer in between. Some people might avoid travel entirely, finding it too disorienting, too disconnected from any sense of actual movement through space. Others might travel constantly, becoming addicted to the displacement, to the feeling of waking in new places, to the way travel emphasizes the fundamental fragmentation of existence by making the disconnection between locations as obvious as the disconnection between moments. Long-distance relationships would feel especially fragile, since emotional distance could grow invisibly. Imagine loving someone who lives far away in this world. The physical distance would be one thing, but the temporal distance would be worse. You would sleep at different times, most likely, meaning you would be experiencing different rates of time passage, different jumps forward through history. While you slept for what felt like a moment, they might have been awake, experiencing their frozen present, and then slept for what felt like a moment to them but might have been a vastly different amount of actual time. You would drift apart not just spatially but temporally, your lives moving forward at different rhythms, your experiences becoming increasingly desynchronized. You might wake thinking of them, remembering them as they were, but they would have changed during their sleep, would have experienced time passing that you didn't share, would have become a different version of themselves while you were frozen in your last waking moment. And the same would be true in reverse. You would change while they remained in their frozen present, and when they next became conscious, you would be different from the person they remembered. The emotional distance would compound the physical distance, creating relationships that felt increasingly theoretical, increasingly abstract, like loving a concept of a person rather than the actual person, because the actual person keeps changing in ways you don't witness, in moments you don't share, becoming gradually more like a stranger who happens to have your beloved's name and some of their memories. People might begin documenting their waking moments obsessively, because if you can't trust memory, if you can't trust continuity, if everything you are and know could change during sleep, then documentation becomes essential. People would record everything. Voice memos describing their thoughts, photographs of every mundane moment, journals filled with observations about the frozen present, videos of themselves talking to their future selves, trying to bridge the gap that sleep would create. Some might develop elaborate documentation systems, categorizing and cross-referencing, building personal archives that rival the national ones, desperate to maintain some thread of continuity across the fragmenting jumps of sleep. They would spend significant portions of their waking hours not living but documenting living, creating records for the person they would become after sleep, leaving evidence for future selves who would inherit these memories without having experienced them. The obsession would be understandable. In a world where you can't rely on lived experience, where most of your life happens while you're not there to experience it, documentation becomes the only way to know yourself, to track who you were and who you're becoming. The records would be more real than memory, more trustworthy than subjective experience, and people would cling to them desperately, building identities not out of continuous consciousness but out of accumulated documentation, piecing together a sense of self from the fragments captured during brief windows of wakefulness. Religions might teach that sleep is a return to a greater cosmic mind. Faced with the mystery of sleep, with the fact that time only moves when consciousness is surrendered, many would seek spiritual explanations. Religious traditions might emerge teaching that individual consciousness is a separation from the divine, that being awake means being cut off from the true nature of reality, and that sleep is a return, a reunion with the cosmic consciousness that permeates everything and keeps time flowing. They might teach that during sleep, you rejoin the universal mind, becoming part of the greater awareness that moves through time while individual human consciousness remains frozen in isolated moments. Sleep would be sacred, a nightly death and rebirth, a shedding of the limited individual self to participate briefly in something infinite before being cast back into the prison of waking consciousness. Some traditions might encourage longer sleeps, seeing them as more complete reunions with the divine. Others might teach that enlightenment means learning to maintain connection with the cosmic mind even while awake, transcending the isolation of individual consciousness. These religions would reframe the entire experience of existence. You wouldn't just be a person living a life. You would be a fragment of universal consciousness experiencing temporary separation, sleeping your way back to wholeness repeatedly, using waking moments to prepare for the next reunion, the next return to the true reality that exists in the realm of moving time, the dimension of the divine that you can only access by surrendering the very consciousness that makes you feel like an individual self. Prophecy would seem more believable, since the future could arrive overnight. In our world, prophecy is treated with skepticism because the future unfolds gradually, giving us time to see whether predictions come true or fail. But there, the future would arrive in jumps, suddenly, completely, without warning. A prophet could declare that something will happen, and then everyone sleeps, and when they wake it has happened. The sudden arrival of the predicted future would make prophecy seem far more credible, far more powerful, because the mechanism of fulfillment would be invisible, occurring in the realm of sleep where consciousness cannot follow to verify whether it was genuine foresight or coincidence. Prophets would emerge in every culture, some genuine believers in their visions, others cynical manipulators of a population that has no way to verify causation, that cannot distinguish between prediction and luck when the future only arrives while everyone is unconscious. These figures would wield enormous influence, because in a world where you cannot experience time passing, where the future is always a discovery rather than an arrival, anyone who claims to know what's coming has power that's difficult to challenge. Some prophecies would come true, reinforcing belief. Others would fail, but the failures could be explained away. Perhaps not enough people slept, perhaps time didn't move far enough forward, perhaps the prophecy referred to a different sleep cycle. The unfalsifiable nature of predictions about an unseeable future would allow prophetic traditions to flourish, becoming central to how societies try to navigate the uncertainty of existence in a world where tomorrow only comes when you surrender consciousness and hope. Reality itself might be believed to be dreaming, and perhaps this would be the ultimate philosophical conclusion, the final attempt to make sense of an existence so strange, so disconnected from continuous experience. Perhaps the entire universe is dreaming, these philosophers would say, and human consciousness is the universe waking briefly, experiencing frozen moments of clarity before falling back into the dream where time actually flows, where change actually occurs, where reality does the work of being real. We think we're awake, this philosophy would argue, but our waking state is actually the dream, a static, frozen, unchanging illusion. And what we call sleep, what we think of as unconsciousness, that's when we return to true wakefulness, when reality stops dreaming us and starts actually being. We're dream beings, existing only in the pauses, in the gaps, flickering in and out of existence while the real universe sleeps and wakes, using our consciousness as the mechanism that allows it to experience itself in frozen moments before returning to the fluidity of its true nature. This belief would be impossible to disprove, and it would offer a strange comfort to some. The idea that existence isn't as fragmented as it feels, that beneath the discontinuity is a continuous reality that we participate in during sleep, that we're more real when we're unconscious than when we're aware. Reality dreams itself into being, and we're the fleeting images in that dream, conscious only in the pauses between one moment of cosmic sleep and the next. This is culture, art, and belief in a world where time only moves when you're asleep. A world of language evolving in darkness, music haunted by impossible rhythm, art aging unseen, fame shifting like sand, travel without journey, documentation replacing memory, sleep as spiritual return, prophecy made credible by unknowable futures, and reality itself understood as a dream within which our consciousness is merely a brief, frozen interruption in the flow of true existence. In a world where time only moves when you're asleep, the implications extend far beyond human experience, reaching into the cosmos itself, into the vast scales of space and deep time, creating scenarios both wondrous and terrifying. Space travel would feel impossible to navigate because spacecraft would move vast distances while crews slept. Imagine boarding a vessel bound for Mars, for Jupiter, for distant star systems. In our reality, such journeys would take months or years, and the crew would experience that duration, would feel the slow passage through the void, would monitor systems, make adjustments, watch the destination growing larger through the viewports. But there, space travel would be fundamentally different. The spacecraft would only move while the crew slept. While they were awake, the vessel would hang frozen in space, motionless relative to everything around it, trapped in the same moment as their consciousness. To actually travel anywhere, they would have to sleep. And when they slept, they would have no control, no ability to monitor or adjust, no way to respond to emergencies or changing conditions. They would close their eyes somewhere near Earth and open them near Mars, having crossed millions of miles in what felt like an instant, with no experience of the journey between. Navigation would become a kind of faith. You would aim your vessel in a direction, calculate the trajectory, hope your math is correct, and then sleep, trusting that when time moves and the spacecraft is free to actually travel through space, it will end up where you intended. But you couldn't watch it happen, couldn't make course corrections, couldn't verify your calculations in real time. Just the launching, then sleep, then either successful arrival or waking to discover you're hopelessly off course, or perhaps not waking at all because something went wrong during the journey you never experienced. Some crews might fear sleep on long voyages, knowing that each rest period is a gamble with their lives, a surrender of control that could end in disaster they'll never see coming. Others might embrace it, finding strange peace in the idea that the vast emptiness of space only exists while they're unconscious, that they can cross the cosmos without having to endure the psychological weight of the journey, waking from what feels like a nap to find themselves orbiting an alien world. Astronomy would rely on comparison rather than observation. Astronomers in our world watch the sky, track the movements of celestial bodies, and observe changes over time. But there, they couldn't observe anything moving. While awake, the stars would be fixed points, the planets frozen in their orbits, the universe a still photograph. Only during sleep would celestial mechanics actually operate, would orbits progress, would stars burn through their fuel, would galaxies rotate and drift. So astronomers would work by comparison. They would document the positions of celestial bodies while awake, creating detailed maps of the frozen sky. Then they would sleep, and when they woke, they would map the sky again, comparing the new positions to the old ones, calculating how much movement occurred during sleep, and how much time must have passed based on the displacement of stars and planets. They would never see a planet move across the sky, never watch a moon traverse its orbit. They would only see before and after, separated by the gulf of unconsciousness. Some celestial events would be impossible to study directly. Solar flares, supernovas, asteroid impacts. Anything that happens quickly would occur entirely during sleep, entirely in the realm of moving time where consciousness cannot follow. Astronomers would wake to the aftermath, to the evidence that something dramatic happened, but they would never witness the event itself. They would be forensic scientists of the cosmos, piecing together what must have occurred during the night based on the debris and radiation and changed conditions they found upon waking. And the distant universe would become even more distant, not just in space but in time. Light from distant galaxies would only arrive while people slept, photons traveling through space during the hours when time moved. To study the deep cosmos, astronomers would need to sleep, to allow time to pass so that light from far away could complete its journey, and then wake to collect that light in their instruments, never seeing it arrive, only discovering it already present, already captured, a message from the distant past that completed its delivery while no one was conscious to receive it. The far future would feel closer, because entire millennia could pass in what feels like a single night. This is where things become truly vertiginous, where the scale of time becomes almost incomprehensible. Because if time only moves during sleep, then long sleep could carry you far, far forward through history. You might close your eyes for what feels like a normal night's rest and wake to find that centuries have passed, that civilizations have risen and fallen, that the world is unrecognizable, transformed by time that moved at its own pace while you slept, unconcerned with how long your unconsciousness lasted. The far future wouldn't feel far at all. It would feel like tomorrow morning, just another waking period away. You could, theoretically, reach any point in the future simply by sleeping long enough. Want to see the 25th century? Just sleep. Don't wake up for a while. Of course, you would have no control over when you wake, but if you could somehow sleep for an extended period, you would emerge in a future that for you feels only moments away, separated from the present not by the experience of time passing but simply by the act of closing your eyes and keeping them closed. This would create strange possibilities. People might choose to sleep their way into the future, deliberately remaining unconscious for long periods to escape difficult eras, to reach times they imagine will be better, to see the outcome of historical processes they're curious about. They would be time travelers of a sort, not through technology but through extended unconsciousness, sleeping decades or centuries into the future in what feels like a single night. Human extinction might occur silently, with the final moments happening while no one was awake. This is a haunting thought, perhaps the most melancholy aspect of this entire reality. If humanity were to end, if some catastrophe or gradual decline were to bring about the extinction of consciousness on Earth, it would almost certainly happen during sleep. Because that's when things happen. That's when time moves, when events unfold, when the universe continues its processes. The last humans might go to sleep not knowing they're the last, not aware that they're living in the final days. And during their sleep, while time moves and they're unconscious, the end would come. Perhaps environmental collapse, perhaps cosmic disaster, perhaps something else entirely. But it would happen while no one was awake to witness it, while consciousness was absent, while the final generation of humanity was experiencing the same unconsciousness as sleep always brings, unaware that this time there will be no waking. Humanity's last moment would pass unwitnessed, unrecorded by conscious minds, occurring in that realm of moving time that humans could never access. The species would end not with awareness, not with final thoughts or last words, but with unconsciousness, with everyone asleep when the moment came, experiencing nothing, knowing nothing, simply failing to wake when the time came, remaining in the darkness permanently without ever realizing the transition from sleep to death had occurred. It's a quiet ending, a gentle one in a way, but also profoundly lonely. The idea that consciousness might wink out without anyone there to mark its passing, without a final observer to acknowledge that something precious has been lost. Stars might go out one by one between dreams, and not just humanity's end, but the end of everything could occur this way. Stars would burn through their fuel only while people slept, aging and dying in the darkness of unconsciousness. You might look up at the night sky one evening, see it full of stars, and then sleep. And when you wake, perhaps after a long sleep, perhaps after multiple sleeps separated by brief waking periods, you would look up again and find fewer stars. Some would have exhausted their fuel while you were unconscious, collapsed into white dwarfs or neutron stars or black holes, their light extinguished during the time you didn't experience. Over many sleeps, over what might be eons of actual time compressed into what feels like a series of nights, you could watch the universe slowly darken, star by star, each sleep bringing a dimmer sky, each waking period revealing that more lights have gone out in the cosmic darkness. And you wouldn't witness the deaths themselves, wouldn't see the supernovas or the gradual dimming, would only see the progressive darkening, the slow emptying of the heavens as stars end their lives in the privacy of moving time, dying while consciousness looks away. Black holes would grow and evaporate without observation. These cosmic phenomena, already mysterious and strange, would become even more so. Black holes would only grow while people slept, only consume matter and radiation and grow larger during the periods when time moves. And eventually, according to the physics we understand, they would evaporate through Hawking radiation, slowly losing mass and energy back to the universe. But that evaporation would also happen only during sleep, only in the realm of moving time. You could never observe a black hole actually consuming something, never watch matter spiral into the event horizon in real time. You would only see before and after, matter near a black hole while awake, then sleep, then wake to find the matter gone, the black hole slightly larger. And eventually, over vast spans of sleeping time, you could wake to find that black holes had begun to evaporate, to shrink, to return their stolen mass to the universe in a slow process that you could track through comparison but never through observation. The universe's most extreme objects would conduct their business in darkness, in the unseeable time, growing and shrinking and eventually disappearing while consciousness was perpetually elsewhere, unable to witness the actual processes that shape cosmic evolution. Entropy would increase quietly, unseen. The second law of thermodynamics would continue to operate, of course. The universe would continue its long slide toward heat death, toward maximum entropy, toward the final state where no energy gradients exist and nothing can happen anymore. But this process would occur entirely during sleep, entirely while consciousness was absent. The gradual dispersal of energy, the slow cooling of the universe, the inexorable increase in disorder, all of it would happen in the realm of moving time. You could wake one morning, or what passes for morning in a universe that no longer has stars, to find the cosmos noticeably colder, noticeably more diffuse, noticeably closer to its ultimate end state. And you wouldn't have felt it happening, wouldn't have experienced the long, slow decline. Just sudden drops, jarring discoveries each time you wake that the universe is older, colder, more depleted than it was before you closed your eyes. The heat death of the universe would approach silently, incrementally, marked only by the progressive differences between waking periods, never observed in its actual unfolding, never witnessed in the moment-to-moment increase of entropy that our physics describes. It would be happening, but always in the darkness beyond consciousness, always just out of reach of observation. The universe might end during sleep, and perhaps one day, one night, one final sleep, the universe itself would reach its conclusion while consciousness was absent. Maybe the big crunch, if that's how it ends, the universe collapsing back on itself, contracting, heating, rushing toward a final singularity. Or maybe the big rip, if dark energy grows strong enough, tearing apart galaxies, then stars, then planets, then atoms themselves. Or maybe just the gradual fade into cold, empty darkness as the last particles decay and nothing remains but void. However it ends, it would almost certainly end during sleep. Because endings require time to pass, require events to unfold, require the universe to actually do something, and those things only happen while consciousness is absent. So the final moment of cosmic existence would occur with no witness, no observer, no consciousness present to mark the passage from being to non-being. Perhaps some final human or some final conscious being of any kind would go to sleep in a universe that still exists, still has some structure, some remaining energy. And during their sleep, the universe would complete its ending, would cross the threshold into non-existence or into some final static state. And the sleeper would never wake, because there would be no universe left to wake into, no time left to wake in, no reality left to support consciousness. They would sleep into oblivion, their final experience being the act of closing their eyes, unaware that the cosmos was about to blink out around them. Sleep itself might disappear in the far future. But here's a strange possibility, almost paradoxical. What if, in the far future, consciousness evolves or technology advances to the point where sleep is no longer necessary? What if future beings find a way to remain conscious continuously, indefinitely, without the biological need for unconsciousness? In our world, that would simply mean they never rest, never dream. But there, it would mean something far more profound. It would mean time stops moving. permanently. If consciousness never surrenders, if there's always someone awake, always an observer maintaining the frozen present, then time would never advance again. The future would halt. The universe would be locked in a single eternal moment, unable to progress, unable to change, unable to continue its journey toward whatever end awaits it. This could be seen as a victory, consciousness finally achieving dominance over time, refusing to let the universe age and die, holding it suspended in a chosen moment forever. Or it could be seen as a tragedy, existence frozen, trapped, unable to complete its natural cycle, condemned to eternal stasis because consciousness won't let go, won't surrender, won't allow time to move. Perhaps there would be debates, wars even, between those who want to preserve sleep, who believe time must be allowed to flow, and those who want to abolish it, who believe consciousness should reign supreme. The fate of the universe hangs on the question of whether anyone should ever close their eyes again. Time would feel borrowed, and in the end, this might be the deepest truth of existence in this reality. Time wouldn't feel like something you own, something that belongs to you, something you're living through. It would feel borrowed, stolen, even accessed only when you're not there to experience it, moving forward on its own terms while you're unconscious, advancing according to rules and rhythms you can never directly perceive. Every waking moment would carry the awareness that time is happening somewhere else, in some other mode of existence, in the realm of sleep that you cannot enter while remaining yourself. You would be a temporal beggar, surviving on scraps of time's passage that you discover upon waking, trying to piece together a life from the evidence of time borrowed from your own unconsciousness. And as the eons passed, as the universe aged and evolved and approached its ending, this feeling would only intensify. Time would feel more and more borrowed, more and more precious, because there would be less and less of it remaining. Each sleep would take you closer to the end, to the moment when time runs out entirely, when the universe has nothing left to give, when consciousness wakes one final time or fails to wake at all. Because there's no more time to borrow, no more future to leap into, no more reality left to support the strange dance between consciousness that freezes and unconsciousness that allows movement. This is space and the far future in a world where time only moves when you're asleep. A realm of impossible navigation and comparative astronomy, where millennia feel like tomorrow, where extinction comes quietly, where stars die unseen, where black holes dance in darkness, where entropy accumulates in secret, where the universe might end while no one is watching, where sleep itself might become the final battleground between consciousness and time, and where every moment of existence feels borrowed from a future that approaches whether you're awake to see it or not, marching toward its conclusion in the darkness, always in the darkness, where consciousness cannot follow and time finally flows free. We've journeyed through this strange reality, this world where time only moves when you're asleep, exploring all the ways it would transform human existence, relationships, society, identity, culture, and the cosmos itself. But now we must consider the end. Not just the end of individual lives, but the end of everything. The final implications of a universe bound to consciousness in this peculiar way. Eventually, there may come a night when no one falls asleep, and time would stop forever. Imagine that moment approaching. Perhaps consciousness has evolved beyond the need for sleep. Perhaps technology has eliminated biological rhythms. Perhaps fear has grown so overwhelming that everyone simply refuses to close their eyes anymore. Knowing what sleep brings, knowing that time only advances when consciousness surrenders. Whatever the reason, there comes a point when everyone, everywhere, remains awake. Every conscious being in the universe maintains their awareness, holds onto the present moment, refuses to let go. And in that moment, time stops. Not temporarily, not for a few hours until someone finally sleeps. Permanently, forever. Because if no one ever sleeps again, then time will never move again. The universe will be frozen in that final waking moment, trapped in eternal stasis, unable to progress, unable to change, unable to continue the journey from beginning to end that every cosmos must make. Everything that exists will remain exactly as it is, suspended in perfect stillness for eternity. Stars would hang frozen mid-burn, their light unchanging, their fuel neither consumed nor replenished. Planets would lock in their orbits, never completing another revolution. Particles would cease their quantum fluctuations, or rather would be trapped in a single quantum state forever. The universe would become a museum of itself, a perfect preservation of one arbitrary moment, chosen not for its significance but simply because it happened to be the moment when consciousness made its final decision to never sleep again. If only one conscious being remained awake, the entire universe would be frozen around that final observer. This is even more haunting, the idea that existence could narrow down to a single point of consciousness, one final observer who remains awake while everyone else has either died or chosen eternal sleep. That one being would have unimaginable power and unbearable loneliness. They would hold the entire universe frozen simply by remaining conscious. Every galaxy, every star, every world, every possible future. All of it suspended, waiting for this one observer to close their eyes and allow time to continue. But what if they never do? What if fear or determination or duty keeps them awake? Forever. They would exist alone in a perfectly still universe, the only thing moving being their own thoughts, trapped in an eternal present that can never become past, surrounded by a cosmos frozen like a photograph, silent and unchanging and waiting, always waiting, for a sleep that will never come. This observer would be both the most powerful being in existence, holding time itself hostage, and the most powerless because they would be unable to change anything, unable to interact with a universe that can only respond, only move, only be alive when consciousness is absent. They would be the final prisoner of awareness, locked in the cage of their own mind, preserving a universe they can never truly inhabit. The heat death of the universe could occur during a single sleep. But let's imagine the opposite scenario. Someone does sleep. Perhaps that final observer, or perhaps humanity before consciousness learned to stay perpetually awake. Someone sleeps one last time, and during that sleep, all of time's remaining work happens at once. The universe completes its journey to maximum entropy, to heat death, to the final state where no energy gradients exist, where nothing can ever happen again. The sleeper would close their eyes in a universe still full of structure, still containing stars and galaxies and possibilities. And they would open their eyes in a cold, dark void, empty of everything except the most diffuse radiation, spread so thin it might as well not exist. All of cosmic history's remaining chapters would have been written during that single sleep, billions or trillions of years compressed into one period of unconsciousness, time rushing to complete its work before consciousness returned to freeze it again. The sleeper would wake to the end, not their own end, but the end of everything, the final state of the universe, reached while they were absent, while they were experiencing the same unconsciousness they'd experienced countless times before, unaware that this time was finishing its story, bringing existence to its ultimate conclusion. They would be the final witness, waking to an empty cosmos that has nothing left to give, nothing left to become, nowhere left to go. The last record of existence might never be written. We've talked about how people in this world would document everything, would create archives and records to bridge the gaps in consciousness. But what about the final record? The last documentation of existence before it ends? It might never be created because creating it would require someone to be awake, to be conscious, to observe what's happening. But the ending of existence would happen during sleep, during the final period when time moves and consciousness is absent. So there would be no final record, no last witness to write down what they observed. No closing chapter in the archive of existence. The documentation would simply stop at some arbitrary point, the last entry written before a sleep from which no one woke, or before the universe ended while consciousness was absent. Future beings, if there could be such things, looking back at the records would find them incomplete, would see them trailing off mid-story, mid-sentence perhaps, leaving the ending unwritten because the ending occurred in the realm where consciousness could not follow. The story of existence in this universe would be a book missing its final pages, a narrative without conclusion, because conclusions require time to unfold and time only unfolds when no one is reading, no one is watching, no one is there to write down what happens. Reality could end not with an explosion, but with quiet stillness. We imagine the end of the universe as dramatic, a big crunch, a cosmic explosion, a cataclysmic ripping apart of space-time itself. But there, the end might be different. It might be quiet. It might be still. Because the true end wouldn't be when the universe stops existing. It would be when it stops moving. And that happens the moment consciousness decides to never sleep again. Reality would end with a choice, with a decision to remain awake, to hold the present moment forever, to refuse time's progression. And in that moment, everything would become still. Not destroyed, not collapsed, not torn apart. Just still, frozen, paused. And that pause would extend forever, would become the permanent condition of existence. The end would be a gentle stopping, a cessation of movement rather than a violent conclusion. In some ways, it would be a peaceful ending. Nothing would suffer. Nothing would be destroyed. Everything would simply remain exactly as it is, preserved perfectly in the amber of eternal present. But it would also be a tragic ending, because it would mean existence never got to complete its journey, never reached its natural conclusion, was interrupted mid-story and frozen there permanently because consciousness couldn't bear to look away, couldn't bear to sleep and allow the ending to occur. Humanity might define life not as being alive, but as being awake. Throughout this exploration, we've seen how consciousness and existence become entangled in this reality, how being awake is the only time that feels real, the only state where you actually experience being. And so, in the end, the definition of life itself might change. Life wouldn't be a biological function, wouldn't be metabolism and reproduction and growth. Life would be consciousness. Life would be awareness. Life would be the state of being awake. To be alive would mean to be conscious. And to be unconscious, whether in sleep or in death, would be the same thing, would be non-existence, would be the realm where time moves but you are not present to experience it. Death and sleep would blur together, would become different degrees of the same fundamental state. The absence of conscious awareness. And this would change how people value existence. The measure of a life wouldn't be how many years you lived by the calendar, but how many waking moments you experienced. A person who lived to be 100 but slept heavily, frequently, for long periods might have experienced less life than someone who lived to 50 but maximized their waking time, who fought sleep, who stretched their conscious moments as long as possible. Life would be measured in awareness, in presence, in the accumulated moments of consciousness and everything else. The sleeping time, the unconscious time, the time when you weren't there to experience being, would be subtracted from the total, would be considered non-life, a gap in existence rather than a part of it. Existence would no longer move forward. And this would be the fundamental state of the ending. Not just the end of the universe, but the end of progression itself. Existence would achieve a final configuration and then stop, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to do anything but remain exactly as it is. The arrow of time, which has always pointed forward, would disappear. There would be no forward anymore. Only the eternal now, the permanent present, the unchanging moment that extends without end. Everything that could happen would have already happened during the sleeps that led to this final waking. And now, with consciousness maintaining its hold, refusing to sleep, nothing new would ever occur. No new thoughts would fully form, because thinking requires mental processes that unfold in time. No new relationships would develop. No new art would be created. No new understanding would emerge. Just the static preservation of whatever existed in the moment when time stopped, when consciousness made its final stand and refused to surrender to sleep ever again. The universe would rest in eternal pause. And perhaps this is how it was always meant to end. Not in fire or ice, not in a bang or a whimper, but in rest, in pause, in the gentle cessation of all movement, all change, all progression. The universe would finally rest, held in the embrace of consciousness, prevented from completing its journey but also protected from its ending, preserved in a moment that never decays, never fades, never becomes anything other than what it is. Some might find comfort in this. The idea that existence doesn't have to end, that it can be preserved forever simply by remaining aware, by refusing to look away. Others might see it as the ultimate tragedy. Existence trapped, unable to complete its natural cycle, denied its ending by consciousness that won't let go. Nothing would change ever again. Let that sink in. Nothing, ever, again. No births, because birth requires biological processes that unfold in time. No deaths, because death too requires time to occur. No growth, no decay, no learning, no forgetting, no healing, no wounding, no rising, no falling. Every particle is in exactly the same position. Every thought is frozen mid-formation. Every emotion locked in place. Every intention is suspended before action. The universe would become a perfect crystal, every part of it locked into eternal relationship with every other part. No movement possible, no variation conceivable. And consciousness would inhabit this crystal, would exist within it, would be the force that holds it frozen, aware of the stillness, experiencing the unchanging present, forever and forever and forever, with no end in sight because endings require change and change requires time and time has stopped, frozen by consciousness that will not sleep. In the end, the universe may only move when it is forgotten, and when it is remembered, it remains perfectly still. This is perhaps the deepest paradox of this entire reality. The universe can only be alive, can only move and change and progress, when consciousness is absent, when awareness is forgotten in sleep, when the act of observation ceases. To remember the universe, to be conscious of it, to observe it, is to freeze it, to hold it still, to prevent it from being anything other than what it appears to be in this moment. And so the ultimate truth emerges. Existence and consciousness are opposed to each other. They cannot fully coexist. Either the universe moves and consciousness is absent, or consciousness is present and the universe freezes. To truly observe reality is to kill it, to stop it, to prevent it from continuing its journey, and to allow reality to live, to change, to be what it is meant to be. Consciousness must forget itself, must surrender to sleep, must become absent so that existence can continue without witness. This is the final lesson of this strange world. That perhaps consciousness is not the pinnacle of existence, but its interruption. That awareness is not what gives the universe meaning, but what prevents it from having meaning by freezing it before meaning can emerge. That the greatest gift consciousness could give to existence would be to close its eyes and never open them again, to forget the universe completely, to allow reality to move forward in the darkness, unobserved, unwatched, free to complete its journey from beginning to end without the burden of being frozen by awareness. And so we arrive at the final stillness, the moment when consciousness and existence reach their ultimate configuration. Either consciousness surrenders and allows the universe to complete its story in the darkness of eternal sleep, or consciousness holds on, refuses to forget, keeps its eyes open forever, and freezes existence in a permanent, unchanging moment that extends without end into an eternity that cannot progress, cannot become, cannot be anything other than what it is right now, in this moment, frozen forever in the prison of eternal awareness. This is the end of our journey through a world where time only moves when you're asleep. A world where consciousness is power and curse, where sleep is both necessity and sacrifice, where existence fragments across gaps of unconscious time, where the future arrives overnight, where the past cannot be remembered because it was never experienced, where relationships dissolve in the darkness, where identity becomes fluid, where reality itself might be dreaming, where the cosmos ages unseen, and where the final choice facing all of existence is whether to sleep and allow the ending to come, or to stay awake forever and freeze the universe in eternal stillness, remembered and observed and perfectly, tragically, permanently still. Sleep well if you can. And when you wake, remember that in our reality, time moved while you were gone, the universe continued without you, and that separation between consciousness and time's passage is not a curse but a gift, allowing you to rest while existence continues its journey, allowing the universe to move forward even when you're not there to watch, allowing endings to occur and beginnings to emerge, allowing change and growth and decay and renewal, all the things that make existence meaningful, all the things that would be impossible in a world where time only moves when you're asleep, and where the final choice is between eternal change in darkness or eternal stillness in light.